Hey guys! Tonight we're floating back in time to the heart of the Aztec Empire, right on to the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco. Imagine stepping onto a wooden canoe, its surface just inches above the waterline, as it glides through narrow canals flanked by green, floating gardens that stretch as far as the eye can see. This isn't just any garden, it's part of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, a sprawling metropolis built on a lake. Yes, a lake. You probably wouldn't survive a day balancing on these swaying patches of soil. But for the Aztecs, it was life itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all are listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You glide through the canals, the wooden oar slicing silently through the water. Mist hangs low over the lake, shrouding the distant mountains in a soft haze. The only sounds are the soft rustle of willows and the occasional call of a bird perched on the edges of the gardens. It's peaceful, almost surreal, but also bustling. All around, you see figures moving across narrow paths, tending to crops that practically glow with health. Corn taller than a man, squash vines curling like living ropes, and beans twining up wooden stakes. These floating fields are called chinampas, and they are the reason Tenochtitlan thrived on water. It's hard to imagine, but in the middle of a lake, the Aztecs managed to grow enough food to feed millions. They didn't just farm on land like most civilizations. They created it. The chinampas are built on lake water, anchored by willows and woven from layers of reeds, mud, and vegetation. They float, but not quite like a raft. They're more like gardens suspended in water, sturdy enough to walk on, strong enough to grow entire fields of crops. And they weren't just a few scattered patches. At its height, the network of chinampas stretched for miles, turning Lake Texcoco into a checkerboard of green, feeding the city that sat at its center. Historians still argue about how the Aztecs came up with the idea. Some say it was pure necessity, a desperate measure to expand farmland when the island city ran out of room. Others believe it was a stroke of brilliance inspired by the marshy landscape. Either way, the result was staggering. Lush gardens that produced food year-round, immune to droughts and far more productive than traditional fields. The Aztecs didn't just adapt to their environment. They transformed it. Your canoe drifts closer to the edge of one chinampa, and you can see the details up close. The edges are lined with willow trees, their roots stretching down into the water, anchoring the soil. The farmers are busy, moving with precision and rhythm. One man scoops rich mud from the bottom of the lake with a wooden paddle, spreading it over the surface of the garden. A woman nearby sprinkles seeds in perfect rows, her hands quick and practiced. In another corner, a young boy gathers beans into woven baskets, stacking them carefully in the bow of a small canoe. The process is seamless, like clockwork. Every bit of land is used. Every plant serves a purpose. Between the rows of corn and squash, marigold flowers bloom bright and gold. At first, you might think they're just for decoration, but the Aztecs were more practical than that. These flowers were planted to repel insects, acting as a natural pesticide. It's the kind of organic gardening your local farmer's market would be proud of, except the Aztecs did it centuries ago. But what really makes it work is the water. The lake feeds these gardens naturally. The soil always moist, the plants never wanting for water. There's no need for irrigation canals or complicated watering systems. The roots stretch down through the mud, finding moisture from the lake itself, even as the hot sun blazes overhead. In a land where droughts could cripple entire regions, the Aztecs found a way to thrive. Historians still debate the productivity of these floating farms. Some claim that chinampas were up to 7 times more productive than regular fields, producing multiple harvests each year. Others suggest the numbers are exaggerated, that the true efficiency of chinampas was more modest. But as you watch farmers move from one row to the next, their baskets filling steadily with fresh produce, it's hard to deny that these gardens worked. and worked well. Your canoe drifts further along, passing clusters of small huts perched on stilts at the edges of the chinampas. Children splash in the shallow water, laughing and chasing each other along the muddy banks. Women kneel at the water's edge, washing woven baskets and rinsing clay pots, the water carrying away the dust and remnants of the day. Life here is fluid, tied to the rhythm of the water, the cycles of planting and harvest, the gentle sway of the floating farms beneath their feet. It's almost hard to believe that all of this exists in the middle of a lake, like some kind of mirage that stretches for miles. But it's real, and it's thriving. The Aztecs didn't just build a city, they built a floating empire, held up by mud and reeds, anchored by willows and sweat, and it worked. It worked so well that Tenochtitlan became one of the largest cities in the world, sustained entirely by these miraculous floating gardens. The sun dips lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the rows of corn and squash. Farmers begin to load their boats with the day's harvest, stacking baskets high with bright green chiles, plump tomatoes, and glossy beans. Soon, they'll paddle their way back to the city, where the markets of Tenochtitlan are waiting, alive with the sounds of trade and the aroma of fresh produce. But for now, the gardens are quiet, the water smooth and untroubled. You watch as the last farmer pulls away, his canoe cutting a perfect line through the reflection of the setting sun. The chinampas drift gently in the breeze, their roots holding firm, their soil rich and dark. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you can almost hear the whisper of willows and the soft rustle of corn in the evening wind. Next, we'll explore how the Aztecs built their floating empire on water, defying nature and transforming Lake Texcoco into a thriving metropolis. The sun climbs higher over the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco, casting long reflections across the surface. You paddle gently, the wooden oar slicing smoothly through the calm water, sending ripples spreading out in perfect circles. Ahead of you, the city of Tenochtitlan rises like a dream, a vast metropolis built on water, its stone temples and bustling marketplaces shimmering like a mirage. But this is no fantasy. The Aztecs built their empire here, right in the middle of a lake. And it wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was engineering genius. As your canoe glides closer, the reason becomes clear. Tenochtitlan wasn't just built near the lake. It was built on it. Entire sections of the city rest on artificial islands made of woven reeds and packed mud, anchored to the lake bed with thick stakes of wood. It's like Venice, but on a far grander scale, with causeways stretching out in perfect lines, connecting the city to the shore. The main avenues are canals, wide and bustling with canoes carrying goods, people, and even livestock. Historians still argue over just how the Aztecs managed such a feat. Some believe it was purely a matter of survival. The island provided natural protection from invaders, forcing the Aztecs to adapt or perish. Others suggest it was a strategic choice, a way to command both the water and the land. Whatever the reason, the result was spectacular. At its height, Tenochtitlan housed over 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world. Your canoe glides through one of the main canals, and you can see the foundations of the city up close. The Aztecs used a method called stake and weave, driving thick wooden poles into the lake bed and weaving mats of reeds and branches between them. Mud and sediment were piled on top, layer by layer, until the surface was solid enough to walk on. Over time, these foundations grew stronger, packed tight by the weight of buildings and the tread of countless feet. You pass under a stone archway, its surface etched with symbols of water and maize. Beyond it, the city opens up into a vast plaza, bustling with life. Vendors shout from market stalls, their blankets spread with bright red chiles, woven baskets of beans, and heaps of golden maize. Women in colorful garments kneel at the edges of the plaza, grinding corn on stone slabs, their hands moving rhythmically as they chat and laugh. The smell of fresh tortillas wafts through the air, mixing with the briny tang of the lake. But beneath it all, lies the secret of Tenochtitlan's success. The chinampas. These floating gardens stretch out from the edges of the city, like fingers reaching into the lake. It's hard to tell where the city ends and the farmland begins, They blend seamlessly, the canals winding through plots of corn and squash, their waters feeding the roots from below. Farmers paddle slowly through the channels, their boats heavy with fresh produce, destined for the bustling market. One of the most striking sights is the causeways, massive stone roads that connect the island city to the mainland. These were engineering marvels in their own right, wide enough for 10 men to walk side by side. The causeways rose above the water, held firm by layers of stone and mud. The Aztecs even designed them with removable bridges, allowing the city to seal itself off from invaders at a moment's notice. It was defense by design, a city that could float but also barricade itself with the lift of a bridge. Historians still debate whether the Aztecs built these causeways purely for defense, or if they were also symbols of power. Some believe the grandeur of the causeways was meant to impress visitors, a way of declaring that Tenochtitlan was unlike any other city. Others argue that their primary function was practical, a way to ensure the smooth transport of goods and people. Either way, the causeways served their purpose well, turning Tenochtitlan into both a fortress and a hub of commerce. You paddle further along the canals, weaving between boats piled high with bright green avocados, woven baskets of beans, and crates of shimmering fish. Vendors call out from the banks, their voices ringing through the still morning air. There's a rhythm to it, a flow that mirrors the water itself. Goods move seamlessly from the chinampas to the markets, from the markets to the temples, from the temples to the people. It's a system as smooth as the gliding canoes, each part connected to the next. The canals themselves are meticulously maintained. Every few meters, you spot workers with long poles, dredging up mud from the bottom to keep the water flowing smoothly. The mud is scooped into boats, paddled over to the chinampas, and spread over the surface as fresh fertilizer. It's a perfect cycle. Waste becomes sustenance, and nothing is left to rot. It's almost like the city breathes, drawing nourishment from the lake and returning it just as quickly. But the most impressive part of this floating empire isn't just its size or its ingenuity, it's its resilience. Despite floods, droughts, and even invasions, Tenochtitlan thrived for nearly 2 centuries, its canals flowing, its gardens blooming. When Spanish conquistadors first laid eyes on it, they reportedly gasped at its beauty. A city that floated, that fed itself from the water, that glittered with temples and markets. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. Imagine floating through those canals at dusk, the water reflecting the warm light of torches along the banks. The stone arches of the causeways cast long shadows, and the soft hum of the market fades into the evening air. Farmers paddle home, their boats piled with produce, the surface of the water barely rippling as they pass. It's calm, ordered, and perfectly synchronized, a floating empire, suspended on water, fed by gardens that drift with the wind. Next, we'll step off the canoe and explore how the Aztecs built the chinampas, layer by layer, reed by reed, transforming water into fertile soil that fed an empire. The morning mist still clings to the surface of Lake Texcoco as you step off the narrow canoe onto the soft, spongy ground of a chinampa. It's almost like stepping onto a patch of earth that shouldn't be there, solid enough to hold your weight, but you can still feel the give beneath your feet. It doesn't sway, it doesn't sink. It simply supports you as if it's been here forever. But the truth is, this patch of floating farmland wasn't always here. The Aztecs built it, layer by layer, reed by reed, turning a shallow lake into one of the most productive agricultural systems the world had ever seen. To understand how the Aztecs did it, you have to imagine the lake as it was centuries ago, vast, sprawling, and dotted with small natural islands. When Tenochtitlan began to swell with people, the Aztecs needed more land to grow food, but instead of conquering more territory, they did something extraordinary. They made the lake itself part of their farmland. The process started with simple reed frames, long, sturdy bundles of dried plants tied together in wide rectangles. These frames were laid out directly on the surface of the water, floating like rafts. Then, the real work began. Layers of mud and sediment, dredged from the lake bed, were piled on onto the reed mats. It wasn't just dumped haphazardly. The Aztecs knew exactly how much weight the mats could hold, and they spread the mud evenly, creating a level surface that floated just above the waterline. It wasn't just mud, either. They mixed in rotting vegetation and lakeweeds, creating a nutrient-rich foundation that would feed crops for years to come. Historians still argue over how the Aztecs perfected this method. Some claim it was trial and error, learning from the marshlands around the city. Others suggest it was a method borrowed from neighboring cultures who also farmed on water. Either way, the result was astounding. Fertile plots of land that floated gently on the surface of Lake Texcoco, tethered to the lake bed with willow trees. And those willows weren't just for show. The Aztecs planted them along the edges of each chinampa, their roots digging deep into the mud and anchoring the floating farms in place. As the trees grew, their roots wove through the layers of mud and reeds, solidifying the structure and preventing it from drifting. These natural anchors didn't just keep the chinampas stable, they also provided shade and helped prevent erosion. It was like planting living fences, sturdy, self-maintaining, and entirely organic. Your footsteps leave faint impressions in the soil as you walk along the edges of the chinampa. Farmers are already at work, scooping fresh mud from the bottom of the lake with wide, flat paddles. They spread it over the surface of the gardens in even strokes, adding another thin layer of nutrient-rich silt to the already lush soil. It's a routine that happens every few weeks, ensuring that the crops have all the nutrients they need. In a way, the lake itself is a never-ending source of fertilizer, its waters teeming with sediment and organic matter. The crops themselves are perfectly organized. Rows of maize, their stalks stretching high into the morning sky, beans twining up wooden stakes, and squash vines creeping low to the ground. It's a brilliant system, one that the Aztecs designed for maximum efficiency. The maize grows tall, providing shade and a natural trellis for the beans, which climb up its sturdy stalks. Meanwhile, the squash sprawls out beneath, its broad leaves shading the soil and preventing weeds. It's like a three-layered garden on a single plot of floating soil, each plant supporting the others. Historians still debate just how productive these chinampas truly were. Some estimates suggest they could produce 7 harvests per year, far outpacing traditional land farming. Others claim that number is exaggerated, but even the most conservative estimates acknowledge that chinampas were among the most efficient agricultural methods of their time. A single acre of chinampa could feed 20 people, a staggering number when you consider the size of Tenochtitlan's population. You pause at the edge of the chinampa, watching as farmers paddle small canoes down the narrow canals that separate the floating gardens. The boats are piled high with fresh produce, green chiles, plump tomatoes, and bundles of herbs. The canals themselves are crucial to the whole system. They're not just for transportation. They're part of the irrigation network that feeds the crops. Water seeps up from the lake into the soil, providing constant moisture. Without the need for elaborate irrigation systems, it's a silent miracle, unfolding day after day. But what happens when the mud and reeds start to break down? The Aztecs had a solution for that too. Every few years, the surface layer of each chinampa was rebuilt, fresh mud spread over the top and new reeds woven into the edges. The willows, now thick and strong, kept the structure stable, while fresh layers ensured that the soil remained rich and productive. It was maintenance, but it was also renewal, an ongoing cycle that kept the chinampas thriving for centuries. Imagine standing there at dawn, the mist still curling over the surface of the water, the distant mountains just shadows on the horizon. Farmers move quietly between the rows of maize, their feet leaving soft imprints in the mud. Canoes glide silently through the narrow canals, their paddles barely making a ripple. Everything is synchronized. Man, water, and earth working in perfect harmony. And then you realize the genius of it. The Aztecs didn't just farm. They engineered their environment to serve them. They took the wild, marshy shallows of a lake, and transformed it into a floating empire of green. A place where food was plentiful, the soil never dried out, and the seasons came and went without fear of drought. In a world where food shortages could topple empires, the Aztecs had created something almost invincible. Next, we'll travel through the weaving of willows and reeds, and explore how these natural elements weren't just tools. They were partners in sustaining Tenochtitlan's floating farms. The soft rustle of leaves fills the air as you walk along the narrow path of a chinampa, the water on either side lapping gently against the reed-lined edges. But it's not just the reeds that catch your eye. It's the rows of willow trees towering above you, their branches swaying gracefully in the breeze. These aren't just ornamental. They're the backbone of the Aztec floating farms, living anchors that kept the chinampas from drifting and disintegrating. When the Aztecs began building their floating gardens, they quickly discovered that mud and reeds weren't enough to keep the chinampas stable. The waters of Lake Texcoco were calm most of the time, but storms could whip up waves that threatened to tear the gardens apart. To combat this, they planted rows of ahuejote willows, a native tree with an astonishing ability to thrive in wet soil. The roots of these willows dug deep into the lakebed, weaving through the layers of mud and reeds, knitting everything together like nature's own rope. Historians still debate how the Aztecs stumbled upon this solution. Some argue it was a stroke of genius inspired by observing the natural marshes around the lake, while others suggest it was simply a matter of trial and error. One season, the willows held firm, while other methods failed. Whatever the case, the result was undeniable. The willows didn't just stabilize the chinampas, they made them permanent. The gardens no longer floated freely, but became fixed extensions of the lakebed, their edges held tight by roots that twisted and knotted like living cords. As you walk along the narrow path, you watch farmers skillfully tend to the willows, trimming branches and weaving new shoots into the edges of the chinampas. The branches aren't wasted. Of course, nothing is wasted here. They're bundled together and used to reinforce the reed mats, adding another layer of structure to the floating gardens. It's like watching nature fold back into itself, every part of the willow serving a purpose. In some parts of the chinampas, you can see living fences, rows of tightly planted willows that create barriers between plots. These weren't just for show. They served as windbreaks, protecting the tender crops from gusts that might otherwise flatten them. The farmers moved through these rows with practiced ease, ducking under low branches, their hands brushing against the bark, as if greeting an old friend. You pause for a moment by one of the larger willows, its trunk thick and gnarled, roots plunging deep into the water below. The air is cooler here, shaded by the thick canopy of leaves that filters the sunlight into a soft green glow. A farmer nearby nods in your direction and gestures to the roots. La madre de las chinampas, he says with a smile, the mother of the floating gardens. It's no exaggeration. Without the willows, the entire system would collapse. But it's not just willows that make the chinampas work. The Aztecs also mastered the use of reeds and rushes, weaving them into dense mats that floated on the surface of the water. These mats weren't just platforms. They were the very foundation of the gardens. Layer by layer, the farmers would stack reeds, mud, and lake sediment, building up a solid base that supported rows of crops. The reeds themselves acted as natural filters, trapping silt and debris, allowing only clean water to seep through. Historians still argue over the lifespan of these reed mats. Some say they were rebuilt every few years, with fresh layers added as the old ones decayed. Others claim the mats lasted decades, their dense weave held together by the willow's roots. The truth is likely somewhere in between. Constant maintenance was required, but the system was designed to be self-renewing. As long as the willows grew and the reeds were replaced, the chinampas endured. Imagine standing on the edge of one of these floating gardens as dawn breaks. The mist clings to the water, swirling around the trunks of willows that rise like sentinels from the surface. Their roots are hidden beneath the dark water, but you can feel their presence, holding the garden firm, binding it to the earth below. The reeds whisper in the breeze, their stalks brushing against each other with a gentle hiss. Farmers wade through the shallow water, their feet sinking slightly into the mud, hands deftly plucking new shoots from the willows and weaving them into the reed mats. It's a kind of silent choreography, an unspoken understanding of what needs to be done to keep the Chinampas thriving. The water laps quietly against the edges, the willows sway in rhythm, and life moves forward, just as it has for generations. But there's more to it than just willows and reeds. The Aztecs were masters of ecosystem design, integrating fish, ducks, and even frogs into their floating farms. These weren't just incidental residents. They were part of the plan. Fish kept the water clean, feeding on algae and pests. Ducks and geese paddled between the rows, their waste adding natural fertilizer to the soil. Even the frogs served a purpose, croaking away the insects that might otherwise devour the tender shoots. It was an intricate dance of life, every creature playing its part. Historians still marvel at the sustainability of it all. In a world that often struggled with droughts, floods, and soil exhaustion, the Chinampas remained fertile and productive year after year. It was as if the Aztecs had unlocked some hidden code, a way to turn the natural chaos of a marshy lake into a machine of endless bounty. As the sun climbs higher, the farmers begin their work in earnest. Canoes filled with fresh mud drift by, their drivers scooping rich silt from the lake bed and spreading it over the surface of the Chinampas. Willow branches are trimmed and woven, new reeds are planted, and the cycle continues, day after day, season after season. It's a testament to patience and ingenuity, a living patchwork of nature and human design. Next, we'll dig deeper into the layering of fertile soil, discovering how the Aztecs didn't just plant gardens on water, they engineered them to be among the most productive farms in history. The soft crunch of soil greets your footsteps as you step onto another Chinampa, its surface dark and rich with nutrients. It's hard to believe that this patch of floating farmland, lush and green, is just layers of mud, reeds, and sheer Aztec ingenuity. But that's the magic of it. The Aztecs didn't just throw mud on water and call it a day. They engineered these gardens with a precision that rivals even modern farming techniques. And it all began with the delicate, deliberate layering of fertile soil. To understand how it worked, imagine the process step by step. First, the Aztecs would lay down bundles of reeds and branches, creating a woven mat that floated on the surface of the lake. This mat was sturdy but flexible, allowing it to bob gently with the motion of the water. It wasn't just tossed together. The bundles were tied and layered methodically, like a woven basket designed to hold the weight of the world. On top of this reed foundation, they spread thick layers of lake sediment and mud, dredged up from the bottom of Lake Texcoco. This wasn't just any mud. It was nutrient-rich, filled with the minerals and organic matter that settled at the bottom of the lake. It acted like a natural fertilizer, turning the Chinampas into some of the most fertile plots of land in the entire empire. Farmers scooped up the mud with wide, flat paddles, piling it onto the reed mats with practiced precision, layer after layer. The Chinampa grew, rising from the water like a green oasis. Historians still debate how thick these layers actually were. Some believe the Aztecs built them up to 1 meter thick, while others suggest that even half that depth was enough to support the lush growth. What's clear is that the layers didn't just sit there. They interacted with the water below, constantly pulling up moisture and nutrients, feeding the roots of the plants above. But it wasn't just mud. The Aztecs mixed in rotting vegetation, old stalks of maize, and even animal waste to enrich the soil. This organic matter broke down slowly, releasing nutrients back into the soil and keeping the gardens productive season after season. In a way, the Chinampas were self-fertilizing, a perfect cycle where waste became food, and nothing was left to rot without purpose. You watch as a farmer in a woven hat scoops fresh mud from a canoe onto the edge of a Chinampa. His hands are calloused but quick, spreading the mud with practiced ease. He moves with a rhythm that's almost hypnotic, his paddle gliding through the water, bringing up another load, spreading it again. He's not just adding soil, he's renewing the land, keeping it alive and productive. It's like watching a living tapestry unfold, one scoop of mud at a time. The layering didn't stop with just mud and reeds. Once the base was established, the Aztecs planted rows of willow trees along the edges. These trees weren't just for show. They served a vital purpose. Their roots reached deep into the soil, binding the layers together and preventing erosion. Over time, the willows grew tall and strong, their branches shading the edges of the gardens and protecting the tender crops from harsh winds. The roots themselves acted like natural barriers, keeping the chinampa from breaking apart during storms. Historians still argue whether the willow trees were planted from the very beginning or if they were added after the chinampas were established. Some say the trees were an afterthought, a solution to erosion problems that came later. Others insist that the willows were part of the original design, a natural scaffold that allowed the gardens to flourish undisturbed. Whatever the truth, the result was undeniable. The chinampas thrived, anchored firmly to the lake bed by nature itself. Imagine standing on the edge of one of these floating gardens at dawn. The water is calm, the surface reflecting the pale light of the morning sun. Rows of maize stretch out before you, their stalks heavy with ripening ears. Between them, beans climb sturdy poles, their vines twining upward, grasping for sunlight. At your feet, squash vines creep along the ground, their broad leaves shading the soil and locking in moisture. You watch as farmers move between the rows, their hands brushing lightly over the leaves. They stoop to pluck weeds, to inspect the beans, to gather squash blossoms in woven baskets. There's a rhythm to it all, a sense of balance that feels almost unreal. These aren't just farmers, they're engineers of the earth, shaping it, feeding it, and drawing life from the water below. And when the harvest is over, the process begins again. Fresh layers of mud are dredged up from the lake, spread across the surface, and mixed with decaying vegetation. The roots drink in the nutrients, and the crops grow tall and strong, season after season. It's a cycle that's almost eternal, each harvest feeding the next. The soil never tiring, never going dry. Historians still marvel at how sustainable this method was. In a time when most empires struggled with soil exhaustion and drought, the Aztecs had perfected a method of continuous growth. The chinampas produced harvest after harvest without fail, feeding not just families but entire communities. As you stand there, you can almost feel the earth breathing beneath your feet, soft, spongy, and alive. The reeds rustle in the breeze, the willows sway gently, and the lake water laps softly against the edges of the chinampa. It's a living system, a masterpiece of both nature and human ingenuity. Next, we'll glide down the narrow canals of Tenochtitlan to explore the waterways and canals that connected these floating gardens, turning the city into a floating paradise of trade and travel. The early morning light glimmers off the surface of the water as your canoe glides through a narrow canal. The soft sound of water lapping against the wooden sides. On either side of you, the lush green of the chinampas stretches out in perfect rows, their crops swaying gently in the breeze. But it's the canals themselves that truly capture your imagination. These aren't just watery pathways, they're the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan, a vast network of waterways and canals that connected the floating gardens to the heart of the city. Historians still debate the sheer scale of these canals. Some believe there were thousands of kilometers of watery roads crisscrossing the city and its farmlands, while others argue the number was more modest. But what's clear is that the canals were masterfully designed, straight and smooth, with depths carefully maintained by Aztec workers who dredged the bottoms regularly, scooping up nutrient-rich mud that was then layered back onto the chinampas. Nothing was wasted. Even the act of cleaning the canals became an opportunity to enrich the gardens. You paddle slowly, feeling the rhythm of the water beneath you. It's almost hypnotic, the soft splash of the oar, the ripple of water spreading out in gentle arcs. On either side, farmers tend to their gardens, moving gracefully between rows of corn and squash. Some carry woven baskets brimming with chiles and beans, while others pause to wave as you pass by. There's a sense of calm here, a smoothness to life that's perfectly in sync with the water's flow. But the canals weren't just for farming. They were highways, the main transportation routes for goods and people. Wooden canoes, called akali, drift past you, piled high with everything from baskets of fresh produce to bundles of reeds for rebuilding chinampas. Traders shout greetings to each other as they pass, their boats gliding smoothly over the water. The canals are wide enough for 2 or 3 canoes to pass side by side, but narrow enough to feel intimate, almost secretive. At intersections, the waterways split and turn, winding their way deeper into the heart of the city. Some paths lead to the bustling markets of Tenochtitlan, where vendors will haggle over fresh fish, bright red tomatoes, and fragrant herbs. Others flow toward the great temples, their stone steps rising majestically from the water's edge, and still more lead out toward the edges of the lake, where fishermen cast their nets and farmers harvest mud for the gardens. It's a living web, perfectly designed to move people and goods with the effortless grace of a river. Historians still marvel at how efficiently the Aztecs used their waterways. Some even suggest that Tenochtitlan was the most efficient urban layout of its time, with goods moving faster by water than they did in many European cities on horseback. Canoes gliding through the canals didn't just transport food. They carried pottery, woven textiles, building materials, and even people. A quick paddle through the water could deliver a family to market, a merchant to his stall, or a fisherman to the farthest reaches of the lake. As you continue down the canal, the landscape begins to change. The lush green of the chinampas gives way to stone embankments, carefully constructed to hold back the water and prevent flooding. These embankments are lined with more willow trees, their roots grasping at the soil, binding it in place. The stonework is smooth and precise, each block fitted perfectly against its neighbor. It's clear that this wasn't just built. It was crafted, designed to last for generations. You drift past small landing platforms where workers unload their canoes, hefting baskets of fresh maize and woven sacks of beans onto stone steps. Children run along the edges, their feet splashing in the shallows as they chase each other, laughing and calling out in Nahuatl. It's a living, breathing city built on water, where even the smallest paths are accessible by boat. And it wasn't just the city that benefited from these watery highways. The canals stretched far beyond the walls of Tenochtitlan, reaching out to neighboring villages and trade posts. Merchants would travel for days by canoe, their goods packed tightly under woven mats to keep them dry. The waterways allowed for swift travel across the valley, making trade between communities quick and efficient. It was a thriving economy, fueled by the flow of water and the steady glide of wooden boats. Historians still debate whether the Aztecs designed these canals with trade in mind, or if they simply expanded on natural water paths that already existed. Some say the waterways were purpose-built, carved and maintained with military precision. Others suggest the Aztecs simply enhanced what nature had already provided, dredging and widening existing channels. Either way, the result was a masterpiece of engineering, a city that floated, not just on water, but on commerce. As the sun climbs higher, you notice the water shimmering, reflecting the outline of stone archways and towering temples in its glassy surface. You can almost see the rhythm of the city in the flow of the canals. A woman rinsing corn husks at the edge of the water, a farmer steering his canoe through the narrow gaps between chinampas, a merchant shouting from the bank as his goods are loaded for the market. It's a city built to breathe with the water, to move with its currents, to thrive where no city should have been able to thrive. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the soft splashes, the distant hum of voices, the gentle creak of wooden boats against stone docks. Tenochtitlan is more than just a city. It's a living organism, with its veins running with water, its heart beating with the rhythm of oars and paddles. The canals are its lifeblood, carrying the pulse of commerce and life from one edge of the lake to the other. Next, we'll step off the boats and wander through the crops of the floating gardens, discovering the rich variety of food that fed Tenochtitlan and sustained its people. The soft rustle of leaves greets your ears as you step off the narrow canoe onto the solid, fertile ground of a chinampa. The soil beneath your feet is rich and dark, and the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh greenery. Before you, rows upon rows of crops stretch out in perfect lines: corn, beans, squash, and more, all thriving on these floating gardens, fed by the waters of Lake Texcoco. It's like stepping into a living pantry, where every inch of soil brims with life. The Aztecs didn't just grow food, they engineered it. The chinampas were designed with purpose and precision, their layers of mud and organic matter creating a soil so rich that it produced multiple harvests each year. Farmers worked with nature, not against it, using the lake's nutrients to sustain their crops, without the need for heavy plowing or artificial fertilizers. The soil was always moist, always ready to nourish the roots of the plants that would feed Tenochtitlan's massive population. Historians still argue over just how productive these floating farms truly were. Some believe that an acre of chinampa could produce 7 times the amount of food that a traditional field would yield. Others claim that while the chinampas were highly efficient, the numbers might be exaggerated. But as you walk through the rows of maize and beans, it's easy to believe the legends. The plants are tall and healthy, their leaves a deep, vibrant green. Stalks of corn tower over you, their ears heavy with kernels, while bean vines twist up wooden poles, stretching skyward. One of the keys to this abundance was the 3 sisters: corn, beans, and squash. The Aztecs understood that these 3 crops weren't just companions. They were partners in growth. Corn grew tall and strong, providing a natural trellis for the beans to climb. The beans, in turn, fixed nitrogen in the soil, enriching it for the corn and squash. Meanwhile, the broad leaves of the squash sprawled out across the ground, acting as a living mulch that shaded the soil and prevented weeds from taking over. It was nature's version of teamwork, a trio of plants working together to flourish. You watch as farmers move between the rows, their hands deftly plucking ripe squash and twisting ears of corn from their stalks. Their baskets fill quickly, heavy with fresh produce that will be loaded onto canoes and paddled to the markets of Tenochtitlan. It's a process that's rhythmic and smooth, like the steady flow of the canals themselves. And it wasn't just the 3 sisters that thrived here. The Aztecs also grew chilies, tomatoes, amaranth, and sunflowers, each crop serving its purpose in the grand design of the chinampas. Chilies added spice and flavor to their daily meals, while tomatoes, small and bright red, were used in stews and sauces. Amaranth, a grain packed with nutrients, was a staple food, often ground into flour for making flatbreads. Sunflowers, with their tall, golden heads, weren't just grown for beauty. Their seeds were harvested for oil and food. Historians still debate the introduction of certain crops to Tenochtitlan. Some claim that tomatoes were brought in from further south, while others insist they were native to the valley. But regardless of where they came from, these crops flourished on the chinampas, providing both sustenance and trade goods for the Aztecs. As you continue your walk along the edges of the chinampa, you notice small patches dedicated to medicinal herbs and flowers. It turns out the Aztecs weren't just growing food. They were cultivating health. Plants like epazote and chamomile grew alongside the main crops, their leaves and stems used to treat everything from headaches to stomach ailments. Even marigolds found their place among the rows, their bright orange petals believed to ward off pests and evil spirits alike. But the Aztecs didn't rely solely on plants. The chinampas were more than just floating farms. They were living ecosystems. Fish swam through the shallow waters of the canals, feeding on algae and providing both food and fertilizer for the gardens. Ducks paddled lazily between the reeds, their droppings adding to the nutrient cycle. Frogs croaked from the edges, snapping up insects that might otherwise feast on the crops. It was a seamless web of life, each creature playing its part in the grand design. The productivity of the Chinampas wasn't just about clever planting, it was about constant care. Farmers worked tirelessly, scooping fresh mud from the lake bed and spreading it over the soil to renew its richness. The canals were regularly dredged to keep them clear, and the water levels were monitored to prevent flooding. In times of drought, the Aztecs diverted water from the main lake into the channels, ensuring that the crops never went thirsty. It was a system of balance, a perfect dance between land and water. You pause for a moment, watching as a farmer carefully ties back a row of beans that have begun to sag under their own weight. His hands are quick and practiced, his movements smooth and deliberate. He nods at you, smiling, and gestures to the overflowing basket at his feet. La madre de maíz, he says proudly, the mother of corn. It's clear that to him, and to many others, these floating gardens are more than just fields. They are the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan, the beating heart of a floating empire. The sun is higher in the sky now, casting long shadows over the rows of crops. Farmers begin loading their baskets into canoes, ready to paddle their way to the markets. The water shimmers, reflecting the bright green of the leaves and the deep blue of the sky. You watch as they push off from the edge, their paddles cutting through the water with practiced ease. The Chinampas drift gently in their wake, anchored firmly by their roots, fed by the lake, flourishing with life. Next, we'll explore how the ingenious irrigation techniques of the Aztecs kept these gardens thriving year-round. Even during droughts and dry seasons, the sun hangs low over Lake Texcoco, its reflection shimmering across the water's surface as you step onto a narrow path flanked by rows of towering maize and sprawling squash vines. You take a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and fresh greenery filling your lungs. But there's something else, a faint trickling sound, soft and constant. It's the whisper of water, threading its way beneath your feet, moving unseen but undeniably present. This is the hidden secret of the Aztec Chinampas, their ingenious irrigation techniques. For the Aztecs, water wasn't just a necessity, it was a resource to be mastered. The Chinampas weren't simply floating farms. They were part of a vast, interconnected water system that brought life to the gardens and ensured crops thrived year-round. It's almost like the fields were breathing, the roots drawing moisture directly from the lake, as if sipping from a never-ending well. Unlike traditional farms that relied on rain or rivers, the Aztecs harnessed the power of Lake Texcoco to create a self-watering paradise. Historians still argue over just how the Aztecs perfected this method. Some believe it was a matter of trial and error, adjusting the heights of the Chinampas until they floated just above the waterline, perfectly balanced between wet and dry. Others insist it was pure engineering genius, a deliberate design that allowed the roots of the plants to extend down into the lake mud, absorbing moisture even during the hottest days of the dry season. Either way, the result was a marvel of sustainability. As you walk along the path, you can see the evidence of this mastery in the lushness of the crops. Rows of beans twine around wooden stakes, their vines heavy with pods. Squash plants sprawl across the ground, their broad leaves shading the soil and locking in moisture. Corn stalks stand tall and proud, their ears full and fat, glistening with morning dew. It's hard to believe that all this is happening without a single bucket of water being carried. No irrigation canals dug into the earth. It's as if the water simply finds its way to the roots, like a secret handshake between plant and lake. The canals that snake through the Chinampas aren't just for transportation. They're lifelines. Water flows through them with a gentle current, weaving around the floating gardens and feeding the soil from below. Farmers paddle their canoes through these narrow waterways, scooping up mud to spread on the gardens, refreshing the layers of soil and ensuring the plants have all the nutrients they need. It's a constant cycle. Mud is dredged, spread, and renewed, and the water keeps flowing, sustaining everything it touches. Historians still debate whether this water management was purely practical or if it held deeper cultural significance. Some suggest that the Aztecs saw the water as a sacred force, a gift from the gods that brought life and prosperity to their fields. Others believe it was simply a matter of necessity, a clever adaptation to living on a lake. But as you watch the farmers move through the rows, their hands brushing over leaves glistening with morning dew, it's easy to believe there was something almost magical about it. One particularly clever innovation was the use of sluice gates, wooden barriers that could be raised or lowered to control the flow of water into the canals. During the rainy season, when Lake Texcoco swelled and threatened to flood the Chinampas, these gates were lowered, diverting excess water away from the gardens and preventing the crops from drowning. In the dry season, the gates were lifted, allowing more water to flow in, keeping the soil moist even under the blazing sun. It was a simple design, but its effectiveness kept the Chinampas productive year-round. You watch as a farmer kneels beside a wooden gate, his hands working deftly to adjust its height. He nods with satisfaction as the water level evens out, just enough to touch the roots of the plants, but not enough to overwhelm them. He sees you watching and waves, his smile wide and genuine. La Madre del Agua, he says proudly, the mother of water. To him, and to many others, the lake isn't just a source of life. It's a partner in growth. The Aztecs also understood the importance of water cleanliness. Unlike many ancient civilizations, they actively worked to keep their water sources clear and unpolluted. Farmers would pull invasive plants from the canals and remove debris that threatened to clog the flow. Fish swam through the water, feeding on algae and keeping the pathways clear. Ducks paddled alongside canoes, nibbling at the edges of reeds, and adding their own form of natural fertilizer back into the ecosystem. It was a living, breathing system, each part connected to the next in perfect harmony. Historians still argue whether this water management was purely practical or if it was also ceremonial. Some records suggest that offerings were made to the water gods, thanking them for the bounty of the Chinampas. Others claim that the sluice gates were sometimes decorated during festivals, draped with flowers and blessed by priests to ensure a good harvest. Whether practical or spiritual, or perhaps a blend of both, the water flowed and the crops grew. As you drift along the narrow canal in your canoe, the water smooth and glassy beneath you, you can almost feel the pulse of the city around you. The canals are arteries, carrying life through the floating gardens, feeding not just the plants, but the people of Tenochtitlan. Every paddle stroke sends ripples across the surface, tiny waves that lap against the edges of the Chinampas, whispering stories of life and growth. Ahead of you, a farmer stands knee-deep in the water, his hands covered in rich, dark mud. He waves, gesturing for you to come closer. He scoops up a handful of the lake sediment and spreads it over the surface of a plot, patting it down with practiced hands. Fertilizer from the gods, he says with a grin. You can almost hear the pride in his voice, the satisfaction of working with nature rather than against it. The sun climbs higher, its light sparkling off the water as the canals hum with life. Farmers paddle their way from one Chinampa to the next, their boats piled high with fresh produce, the water sloshing gently with each stroke. It's a system that seems almost enchanted, self-sustaining, endlessly renewing, and perfectly balanced. Next, we'll paddle further into the waterways to explore the aquatic allies that lived alongside the Chinampas: fish, ducks, and even frogs, all playing a part in keeping the floating farms thriving. The morning mist clings to the surface of the canals as you paddle gently through the narrow waterways, the Chinampa stretching out like green carpets on either side. The water is still and clear, reflecting the towering maize stalks and the delicate vines of beans that drape over the edges of the floating gardens. But as you look closer, you start to see flickers of movement beneath the surface, shimmering shapes darting between the reeds and rippling just below the waterline. These are the aquatic allies of the Aztec farmers: fish, ducks, and even frogs, creatures that played an unexpected but crucial role in maintaining the health of the floating farms. The Aztecs weren't just farmers. They were ecosystem engineers. They understood that a healthy garden wasn't just about soil and water. It was about balance. The canals that wound through the Chinampas weren't just for transportation or irrigation. They were thriving ecosystems. Fish like tilapia and carp swam freely through the waters, feeding on algae and insects. Their constant movement stirred up the lakebed, preventing sediment from settling too thickly and keeping the water channels clear. Historians still debate whether the Aztecs deliberately stocked these fish, or if they simply thrived naturally in the waterways. Some argue that fish breeding was an intentional practice, with farmers actively managing populations to maintain the health of the canals. Others suggest that the fish were simply part of the lake's natural bounty, taking advantage of the rich nutrients that flowed from the Chinampas. Regardless of the origins, the result was unmistakable. The fish thrived. And so did the floating farms. You lean over the side of the canoe, watching as a silvery flash darts beneath the surface, its scales catching the early light. A farmer paddling nearby waves and holds up a wicker basket filled with flopping fish, their tails slapping rhythmically against the woven strands. La cosecha del agua, he calls out with a grin. The harvest of the water. For the Aztecs, the canals weren't just pathways. They were food sources, brimming with life that sustained the people of Tenochtitlan. But it wasn't just fish. The waterways were also home to ducks and geese, their soft quacks and fluttering wings adding to the symphony of life that filled the floating gardens. These birds weren't just a pleasant sight. They were part of the ecosystem's delicate balance. Ducks paddled along the edges of the Chinampas, nibbling on invasive weeds and unwanted insects. Their droppings, rich in nutrients, settled into the water and fed the plants from below. It was a cycle of life that the Aztecs understood intuitively. Nothing was wasted, and everything contributed to the health of the gardens. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs actively managed the bird populations or simply welcomed their presence. Some evidence suggests that certain families even built floating nesting platforms to encourage ducks to roost near their Chinampas. Others believe the birds were simply drawn to the rich vegetation and steady supply of food. Either way, the partnership was clear. The ducks kept pests in check, fertilized the water, and occasionally they found their way to the dinner table. As you paddle further along the water's edge, the sound of croaking grows louder, rising in a rhythmic chorus that echoes off the water. You pause, listening, and then spot them. Frogs, dozens of them, resting on the damp soil, their slick bodies glimmering with dew. For the Aztecs, frogs were both a blessing and a warning. Their presence signaled healthy water. Their sudden disappearance was often a sign of pollution or imbalance. The frogs feasted on mosquitoes and other insects, keeping the pest population low and the crops safe from infestation. It's almost like the entire ecosystem is choreographed, a natural orchestra where every creature plays its part. The fish clean the water, the ducks clear the weeds, and the frogs keep the insects at bay. All the while, the farmers move through the rows of corn and beans, their hands brushing over leaves and vines, checking for pests and plucking ripe vegetables from their stems. It's not just farming. It's living with the land, using its natural inhabitants as allies rather than obstacles. Historians still debate whether this delicate balance was intentional or simply the result of generations of adaptation. Some argue that the Aztecs practiced what we now call integrated pest management, a method of farming that encourages natural predators to control insect populations. Others believe it was a happy accident, a byproduct of living so closely with the water and its creatures. But as you watch a farmer gently scoop a frog out of his bean patch and place it back in the water, it's hard not to believe there was some purpose behind it. You paddle further along, passing clusters of reed baskets bobbing in the water, their contents hidden from view. The farmer waves you over, and lifts one of the baskets from the canal, water dripping from its woven sides. Inside, glistening fish squirm and flick their tails, fresh from the water and destined for the market. It's a simple method. No hooks, no nets, just a clever trap that lets the lake provide its bounty. The Aztecs even designed fish gates, small barriers that allowed water to pass freely, but kept larger fish penned in certain sections of the canal. This not only made fishing easier, but also prevented overfishing, ensuring the canals remained teeming with life. It was a system of sustainability, one that modern farmers might still envy. Imagine paddling through these canals at dawn, the mist rising from the water, the calls of ducks echoing across the lake. Fish dart beneath your boat, the sunlight flickering off their scales, while frogs plop softly into the water as you pass by. Farmers move along the edges of the chinampas, their canoes piled high with fresh vegetables and baskets of fish. It's a world in balance, where water, earth, and life are woven together in perfect harmony. Next, we'll step out of this canoe and walk through a day in the life of an Aztec farmer, tending to the floating gardens with a precision and rhythm that kept Tenochtitlan fed for generations. The mist hangs low over the water as the first light of dawn creeps over the edge of Lake Texcoco, casting long shadows over the narrow paths of the chinampas. The air is crisp, tinged with the scent of damp earth and fresh greenery. You watch as farmers emerge from their simple thatched homes, stretching their limbs and gathering their tools. It's the beginning of another day on the floating gardens of Tenochtitlan, and you're about to experience the daily life of an Aztec farmer. The first task of the morning is always the inspection of the crops. Farmers stroll along the raised paths that crisscross the chinampas, their eyes sharp and focused. They move between rows of maize, beans, and squash, brushing their hands gently over the leaves, feeling for moisture, checking for pests. It's a ritual of sorts, a moment to connect with the earth and see what the night has left behind. The dew is heavy, clinging to the leaves and dripping into the soil. It's a good sign, plenty of moisture for the roots. Historians still debate how structured this routine was. Some suggest that Aztec farmers operated with military precision, inspecting their plots at the same time every day. Others believe it was more fluid, dictated by weather and the needs of the crops. What's certain is that the farmers knew their gardens intimately. They could spot a pest problem or a patch of rot with just a quick glance, their hands moving with practiced ease to pluck away the problem before it could spread. As you follow along the path, you notice that many of the farmers carry woven baskets slung over their shoulders, already filled with tools and fresh seedlings. They move with purpose, stopping occasionally to scoop a handful of mud from the shallow canals and spread it over the soil. This isn't just maintenance, it's renewal. The rich mud from the lake bed is teeming with nutrients, and spreading it across the chinampas ensures that the soil remains fertile and productive year after year. You watch as a farmer kneels beside a row of bean plants, his hands deftly pulling away the few weeds that have sprouted overnight. He's quick and methodical, his fingers moving with the confidence of someone who has done this 1,000 times before. The weeds are tossed into the water, where they'll break down and eventually be dredged up as fresh fertilizer. Nothing is wasted here. Everything has a purpose. Even the refuse. The sun climbs higher, and with it comes the water carriers, young men with wooden buckets slung across their backs, moving carefully along the narrow paths. Though the chinampas are mostly self-watering, the edges sometimes need a bit of help, especially during the dry season. The water carriers dip their buckets into the canal, hoisting them up with practiced ease, and splashing the edges of the gardens where the soil is driest. The water trickles down through the roots, feeding the plants from the ground up. Historians still argue over the exact techniques the Aztecs used to manage water on the chinampas. Some claim that sluice gates were raised and lowered throughout the day to control the flow, while others believe the farmers simply used natural absorption and careful planting techniques to keep the soil moist. What's certain is that these gardens never seem to dry out, even during droughts. The lake provided, and the farmers harnessed its gifts with skill and patience, You follow the farmers deeper into the chinampas, where harvesting has already begun. Women move gracefully between rows of squash, their hands plucking the ripest gourds from the vines and stacking them neatly into woven baskets. Their movements are quick and fluid, a dance perfected through generations. You can almost hear the rhythm in it, the soft thud of squash hitting the basket, the whisper of leaves brushed aside, the creak of woven reeds underfoot. The harvested produce is loaded onto canoes, which drift silently along the narrow canals that thread through the gardens. It's a smooth process. Baskets are handed off, stacked carefully, and secured with woven mats to keep everything in place. A single canoe can carry hundreds of pounds of fresh vegetables, gliding effortlessly through the water, guided by nothing more than a wooden paddle. It's almost meditative to watch, the canoe barely disturbing the surface of the lake as it moves toward the markets of Tenochtitlan. But the work doesn't stop there. Once the morning harvest is complete, the farmers turn to maintenance tasks. Paths are swept clear of debris. Fresh mud is spread where the soil is thinnest, and the willow roots are checked for signs of wear or damage. The willows themselves are trimmed back, their branches woven into the edges of the chinampas to strengthen the barriers. It's a continuous cycle of care, each task building upon the last, ensuring that the gardens remain strong and productive. Historians still debate how organized these maintenance routines were. Some claim that Aztec farmers operated in family units, each responsible for a section of the chinampas. Others suggest that entire communities would gather for larger tasks, like dredging the canals or reinforcing the willow barriers. What's not in dispute is the result. The chinampas remained fertile and thriving, feeding the city with reliable harvests year after year. You pause for a moment at the edge of the chinampa, watching as a farmer pats the soil around the base of a tall corn stalk. His hands are rough and calloused, but gentle as they press the earth back into place. He leans back, wiping the sweat from his brow, and nods to himself in satisfaction. For him, and for the thousands like him, this isn't just a job, it's a way of life. A rhythm as natural as the sunrise and just as reliable. The sun is high now, its light shimmering off the surface of the canals. Farmers begin to break for a meal, gathering under the shade of willow trees, their baskets piled high with fresh maize and squash. They laugh and talk in low voices, sharing tortillas and beans, their eyes scanning the fields even as they rest. It's a brief pause before the work begins again, an unending cycle of growth, harvest, and renewal. Next, we'll follow those canoes as they paddle toward the bustling markets of Tenochtitlan, where the bounty of the chinampas feeds not just families, but an entire empire. The morning mist lifts from the surface of Lake Texcoco as you step onto the wooden dock, your feet settling onto the stone pathway that leads toward the bustling markets of Tenochtitlan. The sun has just begun to climb, casting long shadows across the canals as canoes drift steadily toward the heart of the city. They are piled high with the bounty of the chinampas, heaps of green chiles, ripe red tomatoes, sacks of amaranth, and bundles of fresh maize. The water glimmers with sunlight, reflecting the bright colors of produce stacked carefully in woven baskets. Ahead of you, the marketplace unfolds like a living tapestry. It's a sprawling expanse of stalls and blankets spread out over the ground. Vendors shouting in Nahuatl to advertise their goods. The hum of conversation and the occasional laugh ripple through the crowd. The air is thick with the scent of fresh herbs, dried fish, and the smoky tang of roasted maize. It's not just food being traded. You see piles of woven textiles, stacks of pottery, and even live ducks waddling in makeshift pens. Historians still debate just how vast Tenochtitlan's markets really were. Some accounts suggest that Tlatelolco Market, the largest of them all, hosted over 60,000 people daily, a staggering number for any city, let alone one built on a lake. Others argue that these numbers are exaggerated, the result of Spanish chroniclers awestruck by the sheer scale of Aztec commerce. But even the most conservative estimates paint a picture of a marketplace unlike any other in the world at that time. A hub of trade where anything from cacao beans to jade jewelry could be found. You weave through the crowd, brushing past vendors selling cacao beans, which the Aztecs famously used as currency. A woman stands behind a low table, her hands grinding the beans into a thick, aromatic paste. The smell is intoxicating, rich and slightly bitter, with just a hint of smoke. Next to her, a man carefully stacks bundles of dried chilies, their red skins shining like polished leather. His fingers are stained crimson from the oils, and he grins widely as a buyer inspects the goods. But the true stars of the market are the fresh produce. Piles of tomatoes gleam in the sunlight, their skins taut and glistening. Baskets overflow with avocados, their dark skins hiding the creamy flesh within. Strings of green onions are laid out in neat rows, their roots still dusted with soil from the chinampas. You can almost feel the energy in the air, the rush of commerce, the steady rhythm of trade that keeps Tenochtitlan alive. Historians still marvel at how the Aztecs managed such an immense flow of goods with apparent ease. There were no horses, no carts clattering through the streets. Everything was transported by water, canoes sliding through the canals with practiced grace, loaded and unloaded by hand. It was a system of pure efficiency, perfectly designed for a city built on water. You watch as a canoe pulls up to the dock just beside you, its cargo piled high with squash and maize. Two young men leap nimbly onto the dock, securing the vessel with thick ropes before beginning to unload the produce. They move quickly, their hands deft and sure, transferring baskets from boat to stall with the ease of long practice. The vendor nods his approval, counting out a handful of cacao beans in payment before turning to haggle with a customer. But it's not just food and textiles that are traded here. You pass a stall selling obsidian blades, their edges glimmering dark and sharp. Another vendor is offering turquoise jewelry, the stones bright and polished, catching the sunlight in flashes of deep blue. Next to him, a woman weaves reed baskets with swift, practiced fingers, her hands moving so quickly that you almost can't track the motion. The marketplace isn't just a place of commerce. It's a display of Aztec craftsmanship and ingenuity. At the far end of the market, you find live animals, corralled in makeshift pens. Ducks waddle about, their feathers fluffed and iridescent. Turkeys cluck and pace, occasionally flapping their wings in frustration. Even small deer are tethered carefully to posts, their eyes wide and watchful. You catch the smell of hay and fresh water, the low hum of animal life, blending with the shouts of merchants and the chatter of buyers. You pause for a moment, watching as a young boy trades a handful of cacao beans for a woven bag of maize. His smile is wide as he hoists the bag onto his shoulder, stumbling slightly under its weight, but laughing as he finds his balance. It's clear that the marketplace isn't just about survival. It's about connection, about the flow of life from the chinampas to the stalls and back again. Historians still argue about the level of control the Aztec rulers exerted over these markets. Some claim that every transaction was monitored, taxes were levied, and the flow of goods was tightly regulated. Others suggest that the markets operated with a surprising amount of freedom, with vendors and buyers negotiating directly, using cacao beans or woven blankets as currency. But what's undeniable is the scale and vibrancy of it all. A living, breathing economic machine that kept Tenochtitlan thriving. As the sun climbs higher, the market grows busier. Canoes pull up in steady succession, their cargoes unloaded and their goods spread out for sale. Women call out to potential buyers, holding up woven baskets filled with bright red tomatoes or ripe green chiles. The sound of haggling rises and falls in waves, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional clatter of pottery. It's more than just a market. It's the heartbeat of the city, a place where life and commerce meet in perfect harmony. You take one last look around, soaking in the colors and sounds, the vibrancy of it all. The market is more than just a place to buy and sell. It's a testament to the ingenuity of the Aztecs, a living example of how the Chinampas fed not just families, but an entire empire. Next, we'll step away from the bustling market stalls and experience the harvest celebrations and rituals that marked the turning of the seasons and honored the bounty of the Chinampas. The sun dips low over the Chinampas, casting long shadows across the floating gardens as farmers finish the last of their harvest. The canals are bustling with canoes, piled high with fresh squash, beans, and maize, their surfaces glistening with the moisture of the lake. But today isn't just any harvest. It's the start of one of the great celebrations of the Aztec calendar, a time when the bounty of the Chinampas is honored with feasting, music, and ritual. As the sun sets, the fires are lit along the edges of the Chinampas, their flames flickering in the evening breeze. The farmers gather around the fires, their hands stained with soil, and their backs bent from a long day's work. But their faces are bright with pride, their eyes alight with anticipation. It's a time of joy and gratitude, a celebration of the earth's generosity and the water's endless supply. Historians still debate the origins of these harvest festivals. Some believe they were rooted in ancient traditions that predated the Aztec Empire, passed down through generations of farmers who lived by the rhythms of the earth. Others argue that the festivals were crafted by the Aztec elite as a way to unify the people and give thanks to the gods who watched over the crops. Either way, the celebrations were grand and unmistakably Aztec. The festivities begin with the blessing of the fields, a ritual performed by priests dressed in feathered cloaks and painted with intricate designs. They walk along the narrow paths of the Chinampas, sprinkling drops of lake water from jade bowls and chanting prayers to Tlaloc, the god of rain, and Chicomecoatl, the goddess of maize. Offerings are made. Small bundles of fresh herbs, flowers, and tiny clay figurines placed at the edges of the gardens. Smoke rises from incense burners, the sweet scent of copal mingling with the freshness of the lake. You watch as the farmers join in, bowing their heads as the priests murmur ancient words. For them, this isn't just ceremony, it's survival. A good harvest means full bellies and bustling markets. A poor one could spell disaster. The connection between the land and the people is palpable, woven together through ritual and tradition. As the blessing concludes, the music begins. Drums beat out a steady rhythm, their deep tones echoing across the water. Shell trumpets sound, their notes rising and falling like the call of distant birds. The people begin to dance, their movements fluid and graceful, arms outstretched and feet moving in perfect unison. It's a dance of gratitude, a celebration of life that sways and pulses with the rhythm of the lake. Historians still argue about the scale of these celebrations. Some believe that only the main Chinampas, those closest to Tenochtitlan's bustling markets, held grand festivals, while others suggest that even the smallest gardens participated in their own way. Regardless of the size, the spirit of celebration was undeniable. Farmers who toiled in the fields by day became dancers and singers by night, their hands calloused from work but soft against the drums and flutes. As the dancing continues, feasting begins. Long wooden tables are set up along the edges of the Chinampas, piled high with the fruits of the harvest. There are tamales stuffed with squash and beans, steaming and fragrant. Roasted maize dripping with butter and salt, fresh tortillas stacked in neat piles, still warm from the fire. Bowls of amaranth and chiles sit alongside clay jars of pulque, the fermented drink made from agave. The farmers eat heartily, their laughter ringing out over the water, their hands reaching for more, even as their plates are still full. You wander along the edges of the celebration, breathing in the scents of roasted vegetables and fresh tortillas, listening to the music that sways and flows like the canals themselves. The people are joyful, their faces alight with happiness and relief. The harvest is good this year. The Chinampas have been generous, and Tenochtitlan will be well fed for another season. But it isn't just about the food. There's a deeper sense of gratitude and reverence woven through the evening. As the feast winds down, the elders gather the community for a final blessing. They speak of the cycles of life, of planting and harvesting, of the waters that feed the gardens, and the sun that warms the soil. Small offerings of maize and beans are cast into the lake, a gesture of thanks to the gods who watched over the harvest. The water ripples softly as each handful splashes into the surface, sending tiny waves out across the canals. Historians still debate the true significance of these offerings. Some claim they were purely symbolic, a gesture of respect to honor the gods. Others argue that these rituals were believed to genuinely influence the next season's crops, ensuring rain and fertility. But as you watch the tiny waves spread across the lake's surface, it's easy to imagine that, for the farmers, the difference didn't matter. The gesture was enough. The night draws on, and the fires burn lower. People begin to drift back to their homes, their bellies full and their hearts light. The priests extinguish the incense burners, their chants fading into the soft murmur of the lake. The dancers rest, their feet sore, but their spirits high, their laughter echoing faintly as they disappear into the shadows of the chinampas. You linger for a moment longer, watching as the last of the offerings are cast into the lake. The water is still now, its surface smooth and unbroken, reflecting the stars that flicker above. It's peaceful, almost sacred, a reminder that these floating gardens aren't just a marvel of engineering. They're a living testament to the Aztec relationship with the earth and the water that sustains them. Next, we'll explore the protections and defenses that kept these gardens safe from floods and rival tribes, ensuring that the floating farms of Tenochtitlan thrived for generations. The morning mist is thick over Lake Texcoco, swirling lazily around the edges of the chinampas. You paddle slowly, the surface of the water smooth and still, reflecting the green of the floating gardens and the distant silhouette of Tenochtitlan's towering temples. But there's something else you notice as you glide along. Stone barriers, dikes, and intricate flood controls stretching across the lake. They weren't built for beauty. They were built to protect the floating farms from nature's unpredictability. For the Aztecs, living on a lake had its advantages: access to water, fertile soil, and natural defenses against invaders. But it also came with its dangers. During the rainy season, Lake Texcoco could swell dramatically, threatening to flood the delicate chinampas and wash away entire harvests. To combat this, the Aztecs constructed massive dikes and levees, stretching for miles across the lake's surface. These barriers weren't just piles of rocks. They were carefully engineered walls designed to control the flow of water and keep the chinampas safe. Historians still debate the true scale of these dikes. The most famous of them all, the Albaradón de Nezahualcoyotl, was said to be over 16 kilometers long, cutting a straight path through the lake. Built of stone and mud, reinforced with wooden pilings, it acted as a buffer, holding back the fresh waters of the surrounding rivers, while allowing the brackish waters of the lake to settle. It was a feat of engineering that rivaled anything in Europe at the time, a testament to Aztec ingenuity and their deep understanding of water management. You guide your canoe closer, brushing your fingers against the stone walls as you pass. The surface is rough but solid, worn smooth in some places by the passage of water and time. Farmers paddle alongside you, their canoes heavy with fresh produce, gliding easily through the narrow gaps in the dikes. They nod in your direction, their faces lined with sun and work, eyes bright with pride. For them, these walls are more than just barriers. They're lifelines, shields against the fury of storms and the rise of floodwaters. The dikes weren't the only defense. The Aztecs also built sluice gates, wooden barriers that could be raised and lowered to control the water level. During heavy rains, these gates would be dropped, sealing off the canals and keeping the water from spilling into the gardens. When the rains passed, the gates were lifted, allowing the water to flow back into the lake in a controlled release. It was a delicate dance, perfectly timed, ensuring that the chinampas stayed moist but never submerged. Historians still argue whether these gates were managed centrally by the Tlatoani, the ruler of Tenochtitlan, or by local farmers who understood the rhythms of the water best. Some believe it was a coordinated effort, with messengers running between districts to communicate changes in water levels. Others suggest it was more localized, with individual communities managing their own sections of the dikes and gates. Either way, the result was the same. The Chinampas remained safe. Even when the lake rose, you paddle further, passing through a narrow channel where the water flows gently against the stone walls. There are watchtowers here, small platforms built on stilts, their bases anchored deep in the mud. Farmers climb the ladders at dawn, keeping a lookout for breaches or rising water levels. If danger is spotted, the alarm is raised, and teams of workers rush to the scene with wooden planks and bundles of reeds, patching the walls before the water can spill through. It's a community effort, practiced and perfected over generations. But floodwaters weren't the only threat. The Aztecs also faced raids from neighboring tribes, many of whom were envious of Tenochtitlan's wealth and its seemingly endless supply of food. To defend the Chinampas, they built watchtowers and stone barriers along the edges of the gardens. Armed guards patrolled the paths at night, their obsidian-tipped spears glinting in the moonlight. Canoes filled with warriors drifted silently through the canals, their paddles moving without a splash, ready to defend the gardens at a moment's notice. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these defenses. Some argue that the watchtowers and armed patrols were more symbolic than practical, a show of strength to discourage would-be attackers. Others claim that the Aztecs were fierce protectors of their farms, turning back raiders with brutal efficiency. What's certain is that the Chinampas remained largely untouched, their rows of maize and squash growing peacefully, even during times of war. As you drift along the edge of the dike, the scale of it becomes clearer, stone upon stone, perfectly fitted, stretching as far as you can see. It's a marvel of engineering. A wall that not only held back the water but channeled it, controlled it, turned it into an ally instead of an enemy. You can almost feel the hum of life within the stones, the farmers tending their gardens, the guards watching from the towers, the water lapping gently against the barriers. The maintenance of the dikes and sluice gates was a community effort. Men and women worked together to patch cracks, replace stones, and clear debris. During festival days, entire families would gather to repair and clean the walls, singing songs of gratitude to Tlaloc, the god of rain, and asking for gentle seasons and bountiful harvests. It wasn't just labor, it was a ritual, a way of giving thanks for the protection the walls provided. As the sun climbs higher, the shadows of the dikes grow shorter, and the farmers begin their journey back to the Chinampas, their canoes laden with tools and fresh mud for the gardens. You watch them paddle away, their movements smooth and unhurried, gliding easily along the surface of the water. It's almost like watching an orchestra, each part moving in perfect harmony, guided by the rhythm of the lake and the steady hands of its people. Next, we'll paddle back toward the gardens and explore the role of women in farming, where their hands, just as skilled as the men's, shaped the floating gardens with care and precision. The first light of dawn spills over the Chinampas, casting soft, golden hues over the fields of maize and beans. You can hear the gentle splash of paddles as farmers make their way along the canals, their canoes piled high with baskets of fresh produce. But as you watch, you notice something often overlooked in tales of Aztec agriculture. The women of Tenochtitlan, moving with practiced grace through the rows of crops, their hands quick and sure as they work the floating gardens. In Aztec society, farming was not solely the domain of men. Women played a crucial and respected role in the cultivation of crops and the maintenance of the Chinampas. From planting seeds to harvesting vegetables, their hands touched every part of the growing cycle. You watch as a group of women wades through the shallow edges of the gardens, their feet bare, skirts tucked up to avoid the mud. They move with confidence, scooping water with woven baskets to splash over the roots of squash vines, their laughter rising above the whisper of the wind through the willows. Historians still debate the division of labor on the Chinampas. Some argue that women worked primarily in the harvesting and processing stages, while men handled the heavier tasks of planting and maintenance. Others suggest that the work was more fluid, with women stepping in wherever hands were needed. What is clear is that their contributions were vital. They planted seeds, weeded the rows, and harvested vegetables with the same expertise as their male counterparts. And when the harvest was done, it was often women who brought the produce to market, negotiating prices and managing trade with practiced skill. You wander further along the narrow path, the damp soil cool beneath your feet. A group of women is bent low over a patch of beans, their hands moving with rhythmic precision. They pluck the pods from the vines, drop them into woven baskets, and move on to the next row without pausing. Their movements are synchronized, almost like a dance, each hand knowing exactly where to go, each step placed without thought. It's clear this isn't just labor, it's an art, passed down from mother to daughter, perfected over generations. One woman pauses, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. She catches your eye and smiles, holding up a handful of freshly plucked beans. La vida de la tierra, she says with a nod. The life of the earth. Her voice is filled with pride, her hands calloused from years of work, but gentle as she cradles the produce. For her, these Chinampas aren't just gardens, they're lifelines, a connection to both the past and the future. Historians still argue over just how central women were to the success of the Chinampas. Some claim that while women participated in farming, their primary role was in domestic work, grinding maize, cooking, and weaving. Others argue that women were full partners in the fields, as skilled and essential as any man. But as you watch them move through the gardens with practiced ease, it's hard to deny their expertise. Their hands are quick and confident, their movements smooth and deliberate. They aren't just helping, they're leading. You follow the women as they make their way back toward the market canoes, their baskets full and balanced perfectly on their hips. Younger girls follow behind, carrying smaller loads but mimicking the movements of their mothers. It's a scene of continuity, of knowledge passed down with each generation. The girls laugh and chatter, their voices light and musical as they help sort the beans and squash, learning by doing, practicing for the day when they too will tend the floating gardens. At the water's edge, women gather to wash the vegetables before they're loaded onto the canoes. They squat low, skirts hiked up above their knees, hands submerged in the cool lake water as they scrub the dirt from the roots and shake off excess mud. Their fingers are quick and sure, moving with a grace that speaks of long practice. They chat quietly as they work, their voices soft and steady, blending with the soft lapping of the water against the wooden boats. But the work doesn't stop there. Back in Tenochtitlan, women play a central role in processing the harvest. Corn is ground into flour using metates, flat stones with a curved surface. The rhythmic scrape of stone on stone fills the early morning air as women work side by side, chatting and singing as they grind the maize into fine, soft powder. This flour is used to make tortillas, a staple of the Aztec diet, as well as tamales and atole, a thick, warm drink. Historians still debate the scale of women's participation in market trade. Some claim that women primarily handled the sale of food, negotiating prices and managing stalls with sharp minds and steady hands. Others suggest their role was more limited, confined to smaller markets while men traded in larger plazas. But even the most skeptical accounts agree that women's hands fed the city, from the planting of seeds to the grinding of maize. They were a vital link in the chain of life. You linger for a moment, watching as the women load the last of their produce into the canoes. The boats are packed tightly, the baskets stacked high and tied down with thick strands of woven reed. A woman steps into the canoe, her feet light and sure, her paddle slicing through the water with practiced ease. She waves to the others, her voice calling out in Nahuatl as she drifts away. Her cargo bound for the bustling markets of Tenochtitlan. You watch her go, the canoe gliding smoothly over the water, its wake rippling softly behind. The fields are quiet now, the work for the day nearly done. The women gather their tools, their laughter trailing behind them, as they make their way back to their homes. For them, the work is hard, but it's also life. A rhythm as familiar as the sunrise and just as necessary. Next, we'll explore how the Aztecs kept their chinampas thriving with sustainability and crop rotation, ensuring that these floating gardens fed the people of Tenochtitlan for generations. The sun rises high over the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco, casting long shadows across the green expanse of the chinampas. You step onto one of the narrow paths, the soil soft beneath your feet, the air thick with the scent of fresh greenery and lake water. Today, the farmers are busy. There's a rhythm to their work, a deliberate sequence that goes beyond just planting and harvesting. It's the quiet art of sustainability and crop rotation, a practice that kept these floating farms fertile and thriving for generations. You watch as a group of farmers move through the rows of corn and squash, their hands quick and practiced as they pull out withered stalks and scatter fresh seeds in their place. But they aren't just planting the same crops again, they're rotating them. Where maize stood tall last season, beans now take root. Where squash sprawled wide and heavy, rows of tomatoes are now beginning to sprout. It's a system that the Aztecs perfected long before modern agriculture even considered it. Historians still debate whether the Aztecs truly understood the scientific principles behind crop rotation, or if they simply observed the benefits over time. Some argue that it was purely practical, a way to prevent soil exhaustion and maintain productivity. Others believe it was rooted in a deeper understanding of the land, a recognition that each crop draws different nutrients from the soil and leaves behind what the next one needs. Whatever the origin, the result was clear. The soil remained rich, and the chinampas never grew barren. You follow the farmers as they scoop fresh lake mud from their canoes, spreading it over the soil in even layers. This isn't just for leveling or aesthetics. It's a form of natural fertilization. The mud, thick and dark, is teeming with nutrients pulled from the depths of Lake Texcoco. As it dries, it settles into the soil, feeding the roots of the new crops and keeping the earth soft and workable. It's a cycle of renewal, repeated with each season, ensuring that the soil never grows tired. One of the most ingenious aspects of this process is the Three Sisters method, a planting strategy that the Aztecs mastered to perfection. Corn, beans, and squash are grown together in a perfect symbiosis. The corn provides a natural trellis for the beans to climb. The beans fix nitrogen into the soil, enriching it for the next season, and the squash sprawls out across the ground, its broad leaves shading the soil and preventing weeds. It's a miniature ecosystem, perfectly balanced, each plant supporting the others in a silent cooperation. Historians still argue over whether the Aztecs were the first to employ the Three Sisters method, or if it was borrowed from neighboring tribes. Some suggest that this technique predates the Aztec Empire, passed down from older Mesoamerican civilizations. Others insist that the Aztecs refined it, turning it into a high-yield method that kept the chinampas lush and productive. Either way, the practice was a stroke of brilliance, one that fed an empire. You watch as a farmer carefully checks the roots of a bean plant, nodding with satisfaction before moving on to the next row. His hands are dark with soil, his eyes sharp and practiced. He doesn't waste a movement, his fingers brushing gently over the leaves, checking for pests, feeling for moisture. It's clear that he knows this garden well. Each vine, each stalk, each plot of land. As you follow him along the path, he pauses by a patch of amaranths, its tall red stalks swaying gently in the breeze. The plant is not only a source of grain, but also a symbol of resilience. Amaranth grows quickly, Its seeds packed with nutrients, and it thrives in the rich soil of the chinampas. The farmer kneels, running his hands over the stalks, his fingers brushing lightly over the grain heads. It's not just farming, it's stewardship, a careful nurturing of the earth that goes beyond mere planting and harvesting. Further along, you see compost heaps piled high with old leaves, broken stalks, and vegetable scraps. Nothing is wasted here. Farmers gather the refuse from each harvest, piling it up to decompose and enrich the soil for the next planting. When the compost is ready, it's spread over the chinampas, mixed with fresh mud from the lake, and turned back into the soil. It's a cycle of rebirth, each season feeding the next. Historians still debate how large these composting efforts were. Some claim that only the major chinampas practiced composting on a grand scale, while smaller farms simply relied on lake mud for enrichment. Others suggest that composting was a widespread practice, a natural part of the farming rhythm. What's clear is that the Aztecs left nothing to rot without purpose. Every stalk, every leaf, every scrap had a role to play in the life of the floating farms. You pause for a moment at the edge of a canal, watching as a farmer paddles by, his canoe stacked with bundles of fresh maize. He waves as he passes, his paddle slicing through the water with practiced ease. In the back of the boat, you can see bags of ash and crushed shells, materials that will be spread across the soil to balance its nutrients. It's a form of natural fertilization, one that the Aztecs mastered through centuries of observation and adaptation. As the sun climbs higher, the farmers continue their work, tending to the gardens with a rhythm that feels as old as the lake itself. They move through the rows of crops, their hands quick and careful, their eyes sharp and discerning. The soil remains dark and rich, the plants grow tall and strong, and the water flows through the canals in perfect synchrony. Imagine standing there at dusk, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows over the chinampas. The farmers pause to stretch their backs, wiping the sweat from their brows, their baskets filled with fresh produce. Canoes glide silently through the water, heavy with squash and beans, their paddles cutting smooth lines across the lake's surface. It's a scene of perfect balance, a testament to the ingenuity and patience of the Aztec farmers who worked with nature, not against it. Next, we'll dive deeper into how the Aztecs left nothing to waste, exploring the nutrient cycling that kept the chinampas fertile for generations, turning scraps and refuse into new life. The sun is high over Lake Texcoco, casting rippling patterns across the water as you paddle slowly through the narrow canals. The chinampas stretch out on either side, their green rows lush and heavy with growing crops. But today, you're not just here to watch the harvest. You're here to understand how the Aztecs mastered the delicate art of nutrient cycling, a process that kept their floating gardens fertile and thriving, season after season, year after year. To truly grasp the brilliance of their system, imagine the cycle from the very beginning. When the first seeds were planted, the roots reached down into soil that was rich, dark, and brimming with nutrients pulled from the depths of Lake Texcoco. The lake mud, dredged up by farmers and spread across the chinampas, was teeming with organic matter, decayed plants, algae, and microscopic life that had settled on the lake bed. It was like nature's own fertilizer, replenished with every scoop and spread across the rows of maize, beans, and squash. Historians still debate whether the Aztecs truly understood the science behind nutrient cycling, or if their methods were born purely from observation and tradition. Some suggest that the Aztecs recognized the benefits of organic decay long before it was understood scientifically. Others argue that it was simply a matter of practicality. Dredging the lakebed not only cleared the canals, but also enriched the soil, regardless of the origin. The outcome was clear. The chinampas never seemed to lose their fertility, always capable of producing abundant harvests. You paddle closer to the edge of a chinampa, where a group of farmers is busy spreading fresh lake mud over the soil. Their hands move with practiced ease, scooping thick, dark sediment from the water and laying it down in smooth, even layers. It's a task repeated several times each season, a ritual of renewal that keeps the earth fertile And it's not just mud. Mixed into the soil are the remains of last season's plants, dried corn stalks, bean vines, and fallen squash leaves, all turned back into the earth to feed the next generation of crops. You watch as one of the farmers rakes the mud across the surface, blending it with the decayed plant matter. It's almost hypnotic. The steady movement of his hands, the rhythmic scrape of the rake against the soil. There's a sense of patience in it. A trust that the earth will provide if it's tended with care. And it always does. One of the most ingenious aspects of Aztec farming was their use of waste recycling. Nothing was left to rot without purpose. Food scraps, discarded husks, and even fish remains from the markets were gathered and brought back to the chinampas. These scraps were buried deep in the soil, where they broke down naturally, releasing nutrients that enriched the crops. It's the same concept as modern composting, but on a grander, more methodical scale. Historians still argue whether this composting process was managed systematically or simply done as a matter of habit. Some claim that certain families specialized in waste collection, transporting organic refuse from the bustling markets back to the chinampas. Others suggest it was more informal, a tradition carried out by each farmer on his own land. Regardless, the result was the same. The soil remained rich and productive, capable of feeding the people of Tenochtitlan with astonishing reliability. You step off the canoe onto the soft soil of the Chinampa, feeling the spongy surface give slightly under your feet. A woman nearby is gathering fallen leaves and vegetable scraps, her hands quick and practiced. She moves along the rows, scooping up refuse and tucking it into a woven basket slung over her shoulder. When her basket is full, she makes her way to a small compost heap near the water's edge, turning the scraps into the pile with a wooden stick. The compost heaps are small but vital, left to decompose naturally. The plant matter breaks down over weeks and months, transforming into dark, rich humus that's eventually spread back over the soil. Farmers tend to these heaps with care, turning the contents regularly to speed up the process. When the compost is ready, it's scooped out by hand and worked back into the earth, renewing the soil and preparing it for the next cycle of planting. It's a perfect loop. The harvest is gathered. The remains are collected. They're composted and returned to the soil, and the process begins again. Nothing is wasted. Everything finds its way back to the earth. Even the canal water plays its part. The farmers use buckets to scoop up water rich with organic sediment, spreading it across the chinampas to refresh the soil. The silt that settles at the bottom is collected and spread as well, adding another layer of nutrients to the gardens. Historians still marvel at how efficient this process was. In an era where soil exhaustion often led to famine and migration, the Aztecs thrived. Their chinampas remained fertile for generations, without the need for fallow periods. The secret lay not in new land, but in taking care of the land they already had, in nurturing the earth instead of exhausting it. You watch as the farmers finish their work, smoothing the soil and patting it down with their hands. A woman nearby sprinkles seeds over the freshly prepared beds, her hands moving in a steady rhythm. The seeds fall like raindrops, settling into the dark soil, waiting for the warmth of the sun and the nourishment of the lake water. It's a scene that repeats itself season after season, unchanged for centuries. As the sun climbs higher, the farmers load their baskets with the day's collection of refuse, paddling their canoes back to the compost heaps to complete the cycle. The water laps gently at the edges of the chinampas, the breeze carrying the scent of fresh earth and growing plants. It's a world in balance, where waste becomes food and decay leads to growth. Imagine standing there at dusk, the compost heaps quietly steaming as they break down the day's harvest refuse, the soil dark and rich beneath your feet. The canals smooth and glassy under the last light of the sun. It's more than just farming. It's a cycle of life, carefully maintained and endlessly renewing. Next, we'll paddle deeper into the canals to explore how these floating gardens not only fed Tenochtitlan, but supported trade routes and expanding influence across the Aztec Empire. The sun shimmers brightly over Lake Texcoco as you glide through the wide, smooth canals, your canoe cutting through the water with barely a ripple. On either side, The chinampas stretch out in perfect rows, their crops heavy and green, swaying gently in the breeze. But today, you're not just floating past the gardens, you're following the path of trade routes that radiated out from Tenochtitlan, carrying the bounty of the floating farms far beyond the city's borders. The Aztecs were not just master gardeners, they were expert traders. The surplus food grown on the chinampas was loaded into canoes and paddled along the canals, reaching the bustling markets of Tenochtitlan, where merchants and traders gathered to buy and sell goods. But the trade didn't stop there. From the markets, the goods were sent further afield, traveling along a vast network of trade routes that connected the empire to distant regions, mountains, coastal villages, and even other cities as far as the Gulf of Mexico. Historians still debate the scale of this trade. Some claim that Aztec merchants, called Pochteca, traveled thousands of miles, carrying goods not just from the chinampas, but also precious stones, cacao, and textiles. Others argue that while the trade was expansive, it was largely regional, focused mainly within the Valley of Mexico. But even the most conservative estimates recognize that the reach of Tenochtitlan was extraordinary, its influence spreading across mountains and valleys, its wealth built on the steady rhythm of paddles in water. You watch as a caravan of canoes drifts by, each one piled high with fresh produce, bright red tomatoes, golden ears of maize, bundles of herbs still dewy from the morning mist. The farmers paddle with smooth, practiced strokes, their eyes focused on the path ahead. It's almost like watching an army on the march, each boat loaded with the riches of the chinampas, bound for the heart of the city where the goods will be traded, bartered, and sold. But it wasn't just food that traveled these routes. The chinampas also produced medicinal herbs, flowers, and even decorative plants that were highly valued in the marketplaces. Marigolds, with their bright orange petals, were carried to the temples for ceremonies, while bundles of medicinal herbs like epazote and hoja santa were traded to healers and physicians. The waterways became arteries of commerce, carrying life from the fields to the city and beyond. Historians still argue about the nature of Aztec trade, whether it was purely commercial or if it also served political and social purposes. Some claim that trade was heavily regulated by the Tlatoani, the ruler of Tenochtitlan, who used commerce to establish political dominance over neighboring regions. Others suggest it was more decentralized, managed by merchant guilds that operated independently but paid tribute to the empire. What's clear is that the steady flow of goods kept the markets of Tenochtitlan thriving and the empire well-fed. As you paddle further along the canal, the landscape begins to change. The narrow water paths of the chinampas widen into grand avenues of water that stretch toward the city. Here, the water is deeper, the banks lined with stone embankments that keep the waves from eroding the paths. Farmers steer their canoes with precision, slipping through narrow passageways, their boats laden with the bounty of the floating gardens. You glide past stone docks, where merchants gather to unload their goods. They call out to one another in Nahuatl, their voices sharp and musical, directing the flow of produce from boat to market stall. The docks are alive with activity. Women sorting through baskets of squash and maize, men stacking bundles of herbs and chilies, children running back and forth with empty baskets to be refilled. It's a dance of commerce, perfectly synchronized, guided by the rhythm of the water. But the reach of Aztec trade extended far beyond Tenochtitlan. Pochteca merchants were the empire's long-distance traders, brave souls who traveled by foot and canoe, carrying goods hundreds of miles across mountains and valleys. They weren't just merchants, they were spies and diplomats, gathering information about distant cities and reporting back to the rulers of Tenochtitlan. Their canoes, when not on foot, were loaded with goods from the chinampas, paddled through rivers and across lakes to far-off markets where Aztec maize, beans, and squash were exchanged for jade. gold, and exotic feathers. Historians still debate just how much influence these Pochteca had over the expansion of the Aztec Empire. Some argue that they were instrumental in securing trade routes and alliances, their negotiations paving the way for political dominance. Others suggest they were simply traders, motivated by profit rather than political power. But there's no denying the role they played in spreading the wealth of the Chinampas far beyond the valley, connecting Tenochtitlan to a vast network of cities and cultures. You watch as another canoe glides past, its cargo covered with woven mats to protect it from the sun. The merchant at the helm nods to you, his face tanned and weathered from long days on the water. His boat is stacked with bundles of dried chilies, sacks of beans, and ceramic jars sealed with clay. It's bound for a market you can't see, somewhere beyond the horizon, where Tenochtitlan's influence stretches like invisible threads. The sun is high now, casting bright patches of light across the water. Canoes continue to stream toward the city, each one loaded with the life of the Chinampas, each one bound for the bustling heart of the empire. The waterways are smooth and clear, the paths well-trodden, the rhythm of trade as steady as the current itself. Imagine standing at the edge of the stone dock, watching as the boats arrive, their hulls heavy with fresh produce, their paddles cutting smooth lines across the water. The merchants step lightly onto the docks, their hands steady as they unload their goods, their voices blending with the soft lap of water against stone. It's more than just trade. It's the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan, the pulse of an empire that floated on water and thrived because of it. Next, we'll travel further down these trade routes to understand how the Chinampas fed not just Tenochtitlan, but supported diplomacy and tribute, strengthening the empire's power across Mesoamerica. The sun is warm over the shimmering canals of Tenochtitlan as you paddle gently through the narrow waterways, your canoe gliding smoothly past the green rows of the Chinampas. But today, you're not just witnessing the harvest or the bustling markets. You're following the path of diplomacy and tribute, the lifeblood of Aztec political power. The floating gardens didn't just feed Tenochtitlan. They helped sustain an empire through strategic alliances and enforced tributes. To understand the true reach of Aztec power, imagine the vast network of cities and villages that stretched across Mesoamerica, all connected to Tenochtitlan by rivers, lakes, and trade routes. At its height, the Aztec Empire ruled over 500 different city-states, many of which were required to pay tribute to the great capital. And what did they send? Much of it was food: maize, beans, squash, and other produce that thrived on the Chinampas. Tribute wasn't just a sign of loyalty. It was a necessity that kept Tenochtitlan's markets bustling and its people fed. Historians still debate the scale of these tribute payments. Some claim that entire boatloads of produce were delivered daily, streaming into Tenochtitlan's markets like clockwork. Others argue that tribute was more seasonal, tied to harvest cycles and festivals. But what's clear is that the flow of food into Tenochtitlan was constant and carefully managed, with records kept on clay tablets to track which city had paid and how much was owed. You watch as a line of canoes drifts past, their hulls piled high with woven baskets of maize and sacks of beans. The men at the helm paddle in perfect unison, their faces serious, their eyes fixed on the stone docks of the capital. This isn't just trade, it's tribute, a symbol of loyalty and submission to the Aztec Empire. In return for their offerings, these outlying cities received protection, political favor, and the right to continue trading in Tenochtitlan's sprawling markets. But it wasn't just food that poured into the city. Tribute also came in the form of luxury goods, feathers from the Quetzal bird, obsidian blades, gold, and even live animals. These treasures were displayed in the grand markets of Tenochtitlan, symbols of Aztec dominance and wealth. You can almost hear the merchants shouting over the hum of the crowd, advertising the brilliance of jade jewelry and the softness of woven cotton brought in from distant lands. Historians still argue about how willingly these tributes were paid. Some suggest that the cities under Aztec rule sent their goods willingly, viewing it as a fair exchange for the empire's protection and access to its trade networks. Others claim it was more of a coerced arrangement, enforced by military might. And the ever-present threat of retaliation, the truth likely lies somewhere in between, an uneasy balance of cooperation and control that kept the empire thriving. You drift closer to the dock, watching as workers unload the tribute. Baskets of avocados, tomatoes, and chiles are stacked neatly along the stone platforms, their vibrant colors glistening in the sun. Clay jars filled with honey and cacao beans are carried off in rows, their tops sealed with woven cloth. Every item is accounted for, tallied by officials who mark down the deliveries on clay tablets, their eyes sharp and calculating. It's not just food, it's power, a display of dominance that stretches for miles beyond the borders of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs were masters of diplomatic gifting as well. When emissaries traveled to distant lands, they carried with them the bounty of the Chinampas, as symbols of goodwill. Woven baskets filled with fresh maize and beans, bundles of herbs, and even tiny jade figurines were given as gifts to foreign leaders, cementing alliances and securing trade agreements. It was a gesture that spoke not just of wealth, but of self-sufficiency, a way of showing that Tenochtitlan had plenty to share. Historians still debate how much influence these gifts truly had. Some claim that the gifts were mere tokens, symbolic gestures that held little real power. Others argue that these diplomatic exchanges were crucial to the Aztec expansion, smoothing over potential conflicts and ensuring loyalty through mutual benefit. What's certain is that the goods of the Chinampas traveled far and wide, extending the empire's influence with every bundle of maize and every basket of squash. You paddle further along the canal, watching as more canoes arrive, each one piled high with tribute. The boats line up along the docks, their paddlers silent as workers unload the goods. The produce is carried up the stone steps and into storage houses, vast buildings that stretch along the water's edge. Here, the food is sorted, tallied, and stored for distribution. Some will go to the market, some to the palace, and some to the granaries, where it will be kept in case of drought or famine. The flow of tribute wasn't just a one-way street. Tenochtitlan, in return, sent out goods of its own, ceremonial weapons, obsidian tools, and textiles crafted by the city's finest weavers. It was an exchange that bound the empire together, a network of trade and obligation that kept the wheels of power turning. When drought struck or floods threatened, Tenochtitlan sent supplies to its tributary cities, ensuring their loyalty through survival. Historians still argue about how much of this was genuine goodwill and how much was political calculation. Some suggest that the Aztec rulers genuinely believed in the duty of care for their tributaries. Others insist it was pure strategy, a way to ensure loyalty through dependency. But as you watch the boats unload, their baskets overflowing with fresh produce, it's clear that the Chinampas were more than just gardens. They were engines of power, feeding not just the people, but the very structure of the empire itself. As the sun sinks lower in the sky, the docks begin to clear. The canoes are paddled back to the fields, empty now, but soon to be filled again with the bounty of the floating gardens. The workers wipe their brows and stack the last of the clay jars, their movements steady and practiced. You watch as the tribute is tallied, the records marked down, and the goods carried away, ready to feed the heart of the empire. Next, we'll follow the wake of these tribute-laden canoes and witness the first impressions of the Spanish conquistadors, who found themselves utterly unprepared for the sight of a floating city fed by an empire of water and soil. The morning mist is still thick over Lake Texcoco as you glide through the smooth waters, your canoe barely disturbing the surface. The Chinampas stretch out on either side, lush and green, heavy with the weight of growing crops. The stone causeways shimmer in the distance, stretching like long fingers from the mainland to the heart of Tenochtitlan. Today, you're not alone on these waters. Far in the distance, strange boats with towering sails glide forward, their pale skins stark against the blue of the lake. The Spanish have arrived, and they are about to witness the floating city for the very first time. Historians still debate the exact emotions that surged through the hearts of Hernán Cortés and his men as they first beheld Tenochtitlan. Some claim it was pure awe, the kind that strikes a person silent with disbelief. Others suggest it was more calculated, an assessment of power and wealth, a measure of what might be gained through conquest. What is certain is that their accounts were filled with astonishment. Imagine it through their eyes. These were men who had sailed across an ocean, traversed mountains and deserts, and seen nothing but dust and wilderness for months. And then, suddenly, a city of glittering stone and green gardens stretched out before them, floating on the surface of a vast lake. Canoes moved like insects across the water, carrying produce from the chinampas to the bustling markets. Stone temples rose from the heart of the city, their white faces gleaming in the sunlight. Causeways crisscrossed the water, wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast. It was not just a city, it was a marvel. You watch as Cortés and his men disembark from their boats, their steel armor clanking against the stone docks. The air is thick with the scent of fresh produce and burning incense. The market's alive with the shouts of vendors and the hum of trade. They stare openly, unprepared for the scale and complexity of what they see. Tenochtitlan is not some collection of huts or crude walls. It's a metropolis, thriving and vast. Its people moving with the ease and confidence of those who know they belong to an empire. Historians still argue over the details of that first meeting. Some claim that the Spanish were greeted with suspicion, others with open arms. What is agreed upon is the splendor that greeted them. Cortés himself wrote that Tenochtitlan was as large as Seville or Córdoba, its markets and temples rivaling those of Europe. His soldiers marveled at the cleanliness of the streets, the flowing water in the canals, the abundance of food that spilled from the chinampas into the market stalls. You follow them as they move deeper into the city, their eyes wide with wonder. The chinampas stretch out around them like islands of green, their crops heavy and lush. Farmers move along the paths, pausing only briefly to nod at the strangers before returning to their work. Canoes glide silently past, their paddles dipping into the water with barely a ripple. It's a world that moves with quiet efficiency, a system perfected over generations. For the Spanish, accustomed to the feudal farms of Europe, where land was tilled by oxen and horses, the sight of floating farms must have seemed like sorcery. They marveled at the chinampas, stretching for miles across the water, their edges held firm by rows of willows and reed mats. Cortés wrote with astonishment about the system of irrigation and transportation, the way canoes moved silently between the rows of crops, ferrying food directly to the city's markets. Historians still debate how much of what Cortés described was embellishment meant to impress the King of Spain. Some argue that his letters were designed to justify the conquest, painting Tenochtitlan as both a marvel and a prize worth seizing. Others believe his descriptions were accurate, that the floating city truly was a marvel that outshone anything the Spanish had seen before. But as you walk the stone paths alongside them, it's hard not to be swept up in the grandeur of it all. You pause at the edge of one of the markets, watching as the Spanish marvel at the abundance of food. The stalls are piled high with squash, maize, tomatoes, and chilies. There are baskets of beans and sacks of cacao, bundles of herbs and fresh fish still glistening from the lake. Spanish soldiers move cautiously through the aisles, their hands brushing over the smooth skins of avocados and the bright red of tomatoes. Some reach out, touching the fine woven textiles, and running their fingers over pottery painted with intricate designs. For the Aztecs, it's business as usual. Farmers haggle with merchants, women barter over baskets of chiles, and children dart between stalls, their laughter rising above the din. But for the Spanish, it's a glimpse into a world they never imagined, a world where food and water flowed with abundance, where gardens floated on water, and where life thrived in a city built on a lake. Historians still argue about the initial reactions of the Aztec nobility. Some claim they welcomed the Spanish with open arms, treating them as honored guests, and showing them the marvels of Tenochtitlan's architecture and agriculture. Others insist there was suspicion and tension from the start, an undercurrent of distrust that would soon bubble to the surface. But for that first day, at least, the Spanish walked among the Chinampas, their eyes wide, their voices hushed with awe. As the sun dips lower in the sky, you watch as Cortés and his men are led back to their boats, their hands brushing the stone walls as if to prove they are real. They step into their vessels, paddling away with eyes fixed on the towering temples of Tenochtitlan and the green fields of the Chinampas. They are leaving, but not for long. The Spanish will return, and when they do, they will bring with them the force of conquest. But for now, the water is calm. The Chinampas still sway gently in the breeze, and the farmers continue their work. The floating gardens remain untouched, their crops growing strong, their roots sinking deep into the mud of Lake Texcoco. It's a world of balance and abundance, untouched, for now, by the fires of war. Next, we'll follow the destruction of the floating farms as Spanish steel and European disease bring unimaginable change to the city on the lake, forever altering the fate of Tenochtitlan. The sun rises slowly over the waters of Lake Texcoco, casting long shadows over the Chinampas. The morning mist clings to the surface, swirling gently as canoes cut through the calm waters, their paddles slicing silently through the reflection of the towering temples of Tenochtitlan. But the peace is deceptive. There is a tension in the air, a feeling of change that whispers through the fields of maize and squash. The Spanish have returned, and with them comes destruction and change that would forever alter the fate of the floating gardens. The initial meetings between the Spanish and the Aztec nobility had been marked with ceremony and grandeur. Gifts were exchanged, feasts were held, and the grandeur of Tenochtitlan was displayed in all its glory. But the Spanish were not merely guests. They were conquerors with plans of their own. Hernán Cortés saw in the floating city an empire of wealth, a prize that could be claimed for the glory of Spain. And with him came more than just steel and horses. He brought disease, invisible but lethal, that would sweep through the city like wildfire. Historians still debate the first outbreak of smallpox in Tenochtitlan. Some claim it came with a single infected slave, brought unknowingly into the city during the first meetings. Others suggest it was carried in by traders who interacted with the Spanish on the coast. What's clear is that the disease spread with unimaginable speed. The Aztecs, with no immunity to European illnesses, fell victim in staggering numbers. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. The canals that once bustled with the traffic of produce and trade ran silent, and the market stood eerily still. You walk along the edge of a chinampa, the soil still rich and dark, the crops still growing tall and green, but the people who once tended them are fewer, their hands slower, their eyes tired. The sickness cuts through families and farmers alike, leaving the floating gardens untended, their lush rows overgrown with weeds. Canoes that once drifted lazily along the water's edge now sit empty, tied to docks that sag under the weight of silence. It wasn't just disease that swept through the city. War followed close behind. Cortés, seeing the weakened state of Tenochtitlan, began his campaign with calculated precision. His soldiers marched through the causeways, steel glinting in the sunlight, their cannons rumbling across the stone paths that had once been trod by farmers carrying fresh maize to market. The Chinampas, once the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan, became battlegrounds. Fields of corn and beans were trampled underfoot, the lush green rows torn apart by the boots of soldiers. Historians still argue about the level of destruction wrought upon the Chinampas during the siege. Some accounts claim that entire sections of the floating gardens were burned or uprooted to prevent the city from feeding itself. Others suggest that the damage was more selective, with Spanish forces focusing on the canals and bridges to cut off supplies. But what is certain is that the perfect harmony of the floating gardens was shattered. The smooth flow of water through the canals was disrupted, the careful layering of soil and reeds torn apart by conflict. You watch as smoke curls into the sky, rising from the edges of the lake, where fires have been set to clear pathways for the Spanish soldiers. Farmers scatter, their canoes paddling desperately through the canals, their baskets of produce abandoned and floating in the water. The orderly rows of the Chinampa, so carefully maintained for generations, are churned into chaos. Where there was once balance, now there is only turmoil. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted for months. Food became scarce, and the floating gardens, once the pride of the city, lay abandoned in many places, their soil cracked and dry without the careful hands of farmers to tend them. The canals, once so perfectly maintained, filled with debris and corpses, their waters stagnant and dark. The Spanish pushed forward, their artillery tearing through the stone causeways, their swords cutting down those who tried to defend the city. Historians still debate whether the Spanish understood the full value of the Chinampas. Some claim that Cortés sought to preserve them, understanding their importance in feeding the city. Others suggest that the gardens were seen as little more than obstacles, paths to be cleared for the advance of the army. Whatever the intent, the result was devastation. The Chinampas, once a model of sustainable agriculture, were left in ruins, their fertile soil scattered, their willow barriers splintered and broken. You step carefully along the path of a ruined Chinampa, the soil still damp beneath your feet, but littered with broken stalks and fallen leaves. The willows that once anchored the gardens now lean at odd angles, their roots pulled from the earth, their branches stripped bare. The water is murky, swirling with debris and ash, its surface broken by the occasional ripple as displaced fish dart beneath the floating wreckage. The conquest ended as brutally as it began. Tenochtitlan fell to the Spanish, its temples toppled, its markets emptied, its people scattered or enslaved. The Chinampas, once the pride of the empire, lay abandoned, their carefully constructed layers of mud and reeds crumbling back into the lake. Fields that had once fed millions were left to rot, the crops untended, the soil left to dry and crack under the sun. Historians still argue about the legacy of the Chinampas. Some say they were left to decay, forgotten, as Spanish settlers sought new methods of farming on dry land. Others claim that the local people continued to tend the surviving gardens in secret, keeping the traditions of their ancestors alive even under Spanish rule. What remains clear is that the fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of an era where water, mud, and human ingenuity had created one of the most remarkable agricultural systems the world had ever seen. You stand at the edge of the water, watching as the sun sets over the remnants of the Chinampas. The lake is quiet now, the canals still, their surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish. The farmers are gone, the market silent. The floating gardens that had once fed an empire now rest beneath layers of silt and ash. Memories of a time when Tenochtitlan thrived on water and soil. Next, we'll explore the rediscovery and revival of the Chinampas centuries later, when historians and farmers alike began to unearth the secrets of the floating gardens and breathe life back into their roots. The sun spills golden light across the surface of Lake Texcoco. Its waters calm, reflective. Gone are the towering temples of Tenochtitlan, replaced by the sprawl of Mexico City, its skyline stretching out toward the horizon. But beneath the surface of modern life, beneath the concrete and steel, the echoes of the past remain. The Chinampas, though scarred and diminished, still cling to the edges of the water. Today, you're walking through the rediscovery and revival of these ancient floating gardens, a journey back to the roots of Mesoamerican ingenuity. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians and environmentalists began to take a closer look at the remnants of the Chinampas. For centuries, they had been left mostly abandoned, choked with weeds and slowly sinking back into the lake. Yet, some communities, small, tight-knit groups of farmers, had quietly continued the traditions of their ancestors, tending to the floating gardens as best they could. The canals, though narrowed and overgrown, still flowed with water, and the soil, layered with centuries of mud and reeds, still held life. Historians still debate exactly when the chinampas were rediscovered as a viable method of sustainable farming. Some say it was in the 19. When environmental concerns over food security and urban sprawl forced Mexico City to look back at its agricultural roots, others claim the revival began earlier, spurred by local farmers who never fully abandoned the traditions of their grandparents. What's clear is that interest surged as people realized the potential of the floating gardens. You step onto one of the paths that snake through the remaining chinampas, the soil dark and spongy beneath your feet. Farmers move quietly between rows of maize and squash, their hands brushing gently over the leaves as they check for pests and pluck weeds from the soil. Canoes drift silently along the canals, their paddles barely disturbing the surface. It's almost like stepping back in time, a glimpse of what Tenochtitlan might have been, hidden in the shadow of skyscrapers and highways. The revival of the chinampas wasn't just about nostalgia, it was about survival. Modern Mexico City, sprawling and dense, struggles with food security and urban overcrowding. The chinampas offered a solution that was not only sustainable, but incredibly efficient. With minimal water and no need for artificial fertilizers, these floating gardens could produce up to 7 harvests a year, just as they did in the days of the Aztec Empire. Environmentalists and agricultural experts began to take note, studying the ancient methods and working with local farmers to bring the gardens back to life. Historians still argue over how much of the original chinampa design remains intact. Some claim that modern adaptations have strayed too far from Aztec techniques, using artificial barriers and chemical treatments that betray the spirit of the floating farms. Others suggest that innovation is necessary for survival, blending the old with the new to face the challenges of modern farming. But as you watch the farmers work, their hands dark with soil, it's clear that the spirit of the chinampas endures. You follow one of the farmers as he moves along the edge of a canal, his canoe piled high with fresh mud dredged from the water. He scoops it out with practiced ease, spreading it over the soil in smooth, even layers. It's the same method that has been used for centuries, a cycle of renewal, where lake sediment replenishes the nutrients of the soil, keeping it fertile and productive year after year. The farmer nods to you as he passes, his hands thick with mud, his face lined with years of work. La tierra siempre da, he says softly. The earth always gives. But it wasn't just farmers who breathed life back into the chinampas. Environmental groups and local organizations joined the effort, launching restoration projects aimed at clearing the canals, removing invasive species, and replanting native crops. They worked alongside the farmers, learning the old methods and blending them with modern agricultural science. Together, they dredged the waterways, rebuilt the reed barriers, and planted fresh rows of maize and beans. It was a rebirth, a return to the rhythm of the water and the soil. Historians still debate whether these efforts are enough to restore the chinampas to their former glory. Some argue that without the full support of the government and the implementation of stricter environmental protections, the floating gardens are doomed to remain mere shadows of what they once were. Others are more hopeful, pointing to thriving farms in Xochimilco, where the chinampas produce fresh vegetables and flowers that are sold in the bustling markets of Mexico City. You step onto a floating platform where workers are busy weaving new reed mats, reinforcing the edges of the chinampas to prevent erosion. Their hands are quick and practiced, tying knots and securing the reeds in tight bundles. A woman nearby sprinkles fresh mud over the surface, patting it down with a smooth, rhythmic motion. She looks up and smiles, her eyes bright. "We are building again," she says proudly, "just like my grandmother did." As you walk further, you see eco-tours drifting silently through the canals, their passengers landing over the sides of canoes to snap pictures of the lush gardens. The guides speak softly, explaining the history of the floating farms, the ingenuity of Aztec engineering, and the efforts to restore the canals to their former glory. Tourists marvel at the green rows of squash and maize, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of floating gardens thriving in the midst of a bustling modern city. Historians still marvel at the resilience of the Chinampas. Against all odds, conquest, urbanization, and pollution, they have endured. Farmers still paddle their canoes through the narrow waterways, their hands still tending the soil with the same care and precision as their ancestors. The gardens still produce, their roots still drawing life from the waters of Lake Texcoco. It's a testament to the ingenuity of the Aztecs and the strength of those who refused to let the gardens fade into history. As the sun sets over the lake, the light catches the ripples in the water, casting golden hues over the rows of crops. The farmers pack up their tools, wiping their hands clean before climbing into their canoes. They paddle away slowly, the soft splash of water fading into the distance. For them, the Chinampas are more than just a method of farming. They are a living connection to the past, a thread that ties them to their ancestors and the great city of Tenochtitlan. Next, we'll explore the modern challenges and triumphs of keeping the Chinampas alive in the face of urban sprawl, pollution, and climate change, and the fight to preserve this ancient practice for future generations. The sun rises over Mexico City, casting long shadows across the sprawling urban landscape. Skyscrapers reach toward the sky, highways snake through neighborhoods, and cars stream along the congested roads, but tucked away in the quiet corners of Xochimilco, the Chinampas still breathe, stretching out over the canals in rows of green. Today, you walk among them, feeling the weight of both tradition and tension. For these ancient floating gardens are facing their greatest challenge yet, the threat of urban sprawl, pollution, and climate change. The landscape is different now. Where once the horizon was marked by the grand temples of Tenochtitlan, it is now dominated by concrete and steel. The lake that once fed the Chinampas has shrunk dramatically, drained and diverted over the centuries to support the growing city. What remains is a network of narrow canals, still threaded with patches of green, still tended by farmers who refuse to let go of their heritage. But the fight is not easy. Historians still debate the extent of damage caused by the draining of Lake Texcoco. Some claim that the decision to reclaim land for urban development was necessary for Mexico City's expansion. Others argue that it was a short-sighted mistake, one that nearly wiped out one of the most sustainable farming systems ever created. What is undeniable is the result. The once vast lake is now fragmented, its waters polluted, its banks crowded with buildings and roads. You walk along the edge of a Chinampa, the soil still dark and rich, but marked with signs of strain. Plastic waste clings to the reeds, bits of litter float by in the canal, and the water, once clear and teeming with fish, is murky and still. Farmers still paddle through the waterways, their canoes heavy with vegetables and flowers, but their faces are lined with worry. They talk of droughts that come sooner and stay longer, of pollution from nearby factories, and of canals that are slowly choking under the weight of urban runoff. But it isn't just nature that threatens the Chinampas. The spread of urban development is encroaching on the floating gardens. Inch by inch, buildings rise where there were once canals, roads cut through the edges of the farms, and industrial waste seeps into the water. The delicate balance that allowed the Chinampas to thrive for centuries is being tested as the city swells around them. Historians still argue whether modern preservation efforts are enough. Some claim that government initiatives to clean the canals and support local farmers are merely symbolic, too small to make a real impact. Others believe that grassroots movements and local activism are breathing new life into the Chinampas, pushing back against the tide of urbanization. What's clear is that the fight to preserve the floating gardens is ongoing, a struggle between tradition and progress, between nature and development. You watch as a group of farmers gathers at the edge of a Chinampa, their canoes tied off and stacked with tools. They move with purpose, clearing the edges of debris, dredging fresh mud from the canal, and spreading it over the soil. Their hands are steady, their faces determined. It's clear that for them, this is more than just farming. It's resistance, a refusal to let go of a legacy that has endured for centuries. There is hope. 2. In recent years, environmental groups have joined the fight, launching restoration projects aimed at cleaning the canals, removing invasive species, and supporting sustainable farming practices. Together with local farmers, they have begun to replant willows along the edges of the Chinampas, reinforcing the banks and filtering pollutants from the water. They have dredged the canals, cleared debris, and reintroduced native fish that help to keep the water clear and the ecosystem balanced. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these restoration projects. Some argue that the damage is too severe, that the Chinampas are too fragmented to ever fully recover. Others are more optimistic, pointing to thriving sections of Xochimilco, where the floating gardens are lush and productive once again. What's undeniable is the determination of the farmers who continue to work the land. Despite the challenges, you step onto one of the Chinampas, the soil soft and rich beneath your feet. A woman nearby is planting rows of amaranth, her hands deftly pressing seeds into the earth. She glances up and smiles. "We are still here," she says firmly, her voice strong. "We will always be here." Her words are simple, but they hold the weight of generations. For her, the Chinampas are not just fields, they are living memory, a connection to the past that refuses to fade. And it's not just farmers who are fighting for survival. Urban gardeners and environmental activists have begun to take an interest in the methods of the Chinampa, studying their sustainability and integrating the techniques into modern farming. Community gardens sprout in unexpected places: rooftops, abandoned lots, and schoolyards, each one a tiny echo of the floating gardens that once fed an empire. There is even talk of expanding the Chinampas, of digging new canals and reclaiming sections of Lake Texcoco to bring the ancient farming method back to its former glory. Historians still debate whether this is feasible. Some claim that the city's needs are simply too great. That urban development will always outweigh the desire to preserve history. Others believe that with the right support, the Chinampas could be revived not just as a nod to the past, but as a solution for the future, a model of urban farming that provides fresh food in the heart of a metropolis. You step back into the canoe, watching as the farmers finish their work, their hands dark with soil, their faces proud. They paddle away slowly, the water rippling gently around them, the green rows of the Chinampas stretching out behind. There is resilience here, a quiet, unyielding strength that speaks of endurance. The canals may be narrower, the lake smaller, but the spirit of the Chinampas remains, rooted deep in the mud of Lake Texcoco. As the sun sets over Xochimilco, casting long shadows over the water, you realize that the story of the Chinampas is far from over. It is a story of survival, of resistance, and of hope. The farmers continue to plant, the canals continue to flow, and the fields continue to produce. The legacy of Tenochtitlan, of a city that thrived on water and soil, lives on. Next, we'll explore the future of the Chinampas, examining the dreams of expanding this ancient method to solve modern agricultural challenges and the possibility of a new golden age for the floating farms. The sun spills over the surface of the canals in Xochimilco, casting shimmering reflections that dance along the rows of Chinampas. The morning air is crisp, heavy with the scent of wet soil and growing crops. Today, you're paddling through the heart of a dream, a vision of the future of the Chinampas, where the floating gardens are not just relics of the past, but a beacon of sustainable farming for the future. In recent years, there has been a surge of interest in urban agriculture and sustainable farming practices. Environmentalists and city planners have begun to look back at ancient methods of food production, searching for answers to modern problems. Among these ancient practices, the Chinampas have stood out as a marvel of efficiency and ecological balance. They offer something rare in today's world, a method of farming that produces food abundantly with minimal environmental impact, all while harmonizing with nature. Historians still debate how scalable the Chinampa system truly is in modern urban settings. Some argue that the delicate balance of water, mud, and organic matter is too complex for large-scale adaptation. Others insist that with modern technology and careful planning, the Chinampas could feed entire cities, just as they did for Tenochtitlan. It's a debate that fuels innovation, with urban planners and ecologists working together to test the limits of the floating farms. You paddle through the canals, watching as farmers plant rows of squash and beans, their hands moving with the same steady rhythm that has sustained these gardens for centuries. But alongside the traditional methods, you spot signs of change. Solar panels glimmer on the roofs of nearby farmhouses, powering water pumps that help regulate the flow of water through the canals. Floating greenhouses dot the edges of the Chinampas, their glass walls shimmering with condensation, protecting delicate seedlings from unexpected frosts and intense heat. The dream is big. Advocates of the Chinampa revival envision a city where floating gardens stretch across the waters of Lake Texcoco, once again, feeding Mexico City with fresh, local produce. Plans are being drawn up for the restoration of old canals and the construction of new ones. There are whispers of vertical Chinampas, multi-layered gardens that float not just on water, but rise upwards, taking advantage of limited space and maximizing output. It's a vision of abundance, one where the city is fed by its own hands, just as it was in the days of Tenochtitlan. Historians still argue over whether these dreams are realistic. Some claim that the environmental damage done to the lake is too great, that the canals are too polluted, and the soil too degraded for large-scale farming. Others are more optimistic, pointing to the restoration projects already underway. In Xochimilco, sections of the canals have been cleared of debris, invasive species have been removed, and the water is slowly beginning to run clear again. It's not just a vision, it's happening. You step off the canoe onto a freshly restored Chinampa, its soil dark and rich, the air humming with the soft buzz of insects. Farmers move between the rows, their hands brushing over leaves and vines, checking for pests and turning the soil. A young woman nearby is spreading fresh lake mud over the surface, her hands moving with the ease of long practice. She looks up and smiles, nodding to the rows of maize and beans behind her. "We are planting the future," she says with quiet confidence. And it's not just local farmers embracing the dream. Environmental organizations and universities are partnering with the communities of Xochimilco, investing in research and sustainable practices. They are experimenting with aquaponics, combining fish farming with the floating gardens to create self-sustaining ecosystems. Fish swim through the canals, their waste fertilizing the soil, while the plants filter the water, keeping it clean and clear. It's a perfect cycle, a modern twist on an ancient method. Historians still debate the potential of these modern adaptations. Some argue that aquaponics and vertical farming stray too far from the original design of the Chinampas. Others believe that innovation is essential, that the ancient methods must evolve to survive in a modern world. But as you watch the plants grow tall and green, their roots stretching deep into the mud of Lake Texcoco, it's clear that the spirit of the floating gardens endures. You walk along the edge of the Chinampa, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the reed barriers. At the far end, a group of school children is planting rows of herbs, their small hands pressing seeds into the soil with care. Their teacher explains the history of the Chinampa, her voice soft but firm as she tells them of Tenochtitlan and the gardens that fed an empire. The children listen intently, their eyes wide with wonder, their hands dark with earth. It's not just history, it's a living legacy. In some places, the dream is already reality. Certain neighborhoods in Mexico City now receive fresh produce directly from the Chinampas of Xochimilco. Local markets boast vegetables grown just miles away, harvested the same morning they are sold. Restaurants are beginning to source their ingredients from the floating gardens, embracing the idea of kilometer zero food. Produce grown locally, sustainably, and with respect for the land, historians still marvel at the resilience of the Chinampas. Through conquest, urbanization, and climate change, they have endured, and now they are being called upon once more to serve their city. Plans are underway to restore more canals, to reclaim sections of Lake Texcoco, and to expand the Chinampa system far beyond Xochimilco. It's a vision of the past reborn, a glimpse of what the future of sustainable farming might look like. As the sun sets over the water, casting long shadows across the rows of green, you watch as the farmers paddle their canoes back toward the docks. Their baskets are full, their hands are dark with soil, and their eyes are bright with hope. The dream is alive, the floating gardens still grow, and the promise of Tenochtitlan endures. Cradled in the mud and water of Lake Texcoco, next, we'll step back and explore the legacy of the Chinampas, how their spirit lives on, not just in Mexico, but around the world as a symbol of sustainable farming and a testament to the ingenuity of ancient civilizations. The sun spills golden light over the waters of Xochimilco, casting shimmering patterns across the canals. You paddle slowly, your canoe gliding smoothly through the water, past rows of lush green chinampas that sway gently in the morning breeze. Today, you're here to understand the legacy of the Chinampas, a legacy that stretches far beyond the borders of Mexico City, whispering through the corridors of history and echoing in modern, sustainable farming movements around the world. The ingenuity of the Chinampas has inspired countless innovations in agriculture. In recent decades, as the global population swells and cities expand, the need for efficient, sustainable farming has grown more urgent. Researchers have turned back to the Aztecs, studying the floating gardens for answers to modern problems. What they found was nothing short of astonishing. The self-watering, self-fertilizing design of the Chinampas, perfected centuries ago, is being revived in urban agriculture projects across the globe. Historians still debate whether the Chinampa method can be fully replicated outside of its original setting. Some argue that the unique properties of Lake Texcoco's sediment and water flow cannot be mimicked in other environments. Others insist that with modern technology and careful planning, the principles of the Chinampas can be adapted to any wetland or river system. Regardless of the disagreement, experiments are underway. In Bangladesh, where seasonal flooding is a constant threat, farmers have begun experimenting with floating gardens inspired by the Chinampas. They build rafts of water hyacinth and bamboo, layer them with soil, and plant rows of vegetables. These floating farms rise and fall with the water levels, thriving even in monsoon seasons when traditional fields are submerged. It's a system that has pulled entire communities back from the brink of starvation, providing food security and economic stability. You paddle further down the canal, watching as a group of farmers tends to their crops, their hands brushing gently over the leaves. The water laps softly at the edges of the Chinampas, its movement gentle and rhythmic. It's easy to see how this system endures. It's not just sustainable, it's resilient. The water nourishes, the soil renews, and the cycle of life continues, untouched by the chaos of the modern world. In Vietnam, the Mekong Delta is also seeing a revival of floating farming techniques inspired by the Aztecs. Farmers there build floating rice paddies that rise and fall with the river's seasonal flooding. The roots of the rice draw moisture directly from the water, while fish and ducks live in harmony with the plants, feeding on pests and fertilizing the soil. It's a perfect cycle. Much like the Chinampas, where nothing is wasted and everything is connected. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs were the very first to master floating agriculture, or if similar methods emerged independently in other river-based civilizations. Some point to the floating farms of ancient China, or the raised fields of the Inca, as evidence of parallel innovation. Others insist that the scale and efficiency of the Chinampas were unmatched, a singular achievement of Mesoamerican ingenuity. What's clear is that the design was so effective, it is finding new life in the face of modern agricultural challenges. You watch as a farmer scoops fresh mud from the edge of the canal, spreading it over the soil with practiced ease. His hands are dark with sediment, his movements smooth and deliberate. It's the same process that has been repeated for centuries, a cycle of renewal that keeps the soil fertile and the crops thriving. As you watch him work, it's clear that the knowledge of the Chinampas isn't just preserved. It's alive, passed down from generation to generation. But it isn't just in distant wetlands that the Chinampas are finding new life. Urban farming movements around the world are drawing inspiration from the floating gardens of Tenochtitlan. In the bustling cities of Europe and North America, rooftop gardens and floating greenhouses are being constructed with the principles of the Chinampas in mind. Water is used more efficiently, soil is renewed naturally, and space is maximized in ways that echo the ancient Aztec designs. Historians still debate the impact of these modern adaptations. Some claim that while the spirit of the Chinampas is preserved, the methods are too far removed from their original form to be truly authentic. Others argue that innovation is the very essence of the Chinampa method, that adaptation and evolution are what allowed them to thrive for centuries. What is undeniable is the inspiration drawn from those ancient gardens, an idea born on a lake that now stretches across the globe. You continue to drift along the water, the light playing off the surface in shimmering waves. At the far end of the canal, a group of university students is gathered, sketching and taking notes. They are part of an international project to study the Chinampas, to learn the secrets of sustainable farming that thrived in the heart of an empire. Their voices rise and fall with excitement as they discuss soil layering, water flow, and crop rotation, concepts the Aztecs mastered long before European settlers even set foot on their shores. And it isn't just students who are learning. Farmers from around the world have come to Xochimilco to study the Chinampas firsthand, to see how these floating gardens can be revived and adapted to meet the demands of modern agriculture. They paddle through the canals, their eyes wide with wonder, their notebooks filled with sketches and notes. It's more than just curiosity, it's hope. Hope that the answers to modern food shortages and environmental strain might be found in the past. Historians still marvel at the durability of the Chinampa design. Against all odds, conquest, urbanization, pollution, it has endured. And now, in the face of global food shortages and environmental change, it is emerging once again, a symbol of sustainable living and agricultural harmony. As the sun sets over Xochimilco, casting long shadows across the water, you watch as the farmers paddle back to their homes, their canoes heavy with fresh produce. The light glimmers off the surface of the canals, dancing in the ripples as if whispering secrets of the past. The Chinampas are still here, still growing, still feeding the people of Mexico City, and now their legacy stretches far beyond the waters of Lake Texcoco, inspiring a new generation of farmers around the world to cultivate with care, to live in harmony with the earth, and to honor the spirit of the floating gardens. Next, we will step back into the canals of Xochimilco and explore the cultural significance of the Chinampas today, how they remain woven into the fabric of Mexican identity and tradition. The morning light spills over the shimmering waters of Xochimilco, casting long, dappled shadows across the canals. The Chinampas, lush and green, stretch out like floating islands, their rows of maize and squash swaying gently in the breeze. But today, you're not just witnessing farming. You're stepping into the cultural significance of the Chinampas, where these ancient floating gardens remain a living symbol of Mexican identity and tradition. For centuries, the Chinampas have been more than just a method of farming. They have been woven into the cultural fabric of Mexico. Families who have tended these gardens for generations pass down the knowledge from parent to child, their hands moving over the soil with the same practiced ease as their ancestors. The canals are more than just water. They are lifelines, cradling the past and feeding the present. Historians still debate the extent to which modern Mexicans feel connected to the legacy of the Chinampas. Some argue that the memory of Tenochtitlan and its floating farms is a distant echo, romanticized but disconnected from daily life. Others insist that the spirit of the Chinampas is alive and well, nurtured by farmers in Xochimilco who refuse to let go of their heritage. And as you walk the narrow paths between the fields, it's hard not to feel that connection. The soil is rich, the plants are strong, and the people are proud. You follow a group of farmers as they tend to their crops, their hands dark with soil, their faces marked by sun and time. They move quietly between rows of vegetables, plucking weeds, turning the soil, and checking for pests. It's not just work, it's ritual. An act of stewardship passed down through generations, rooted in the belief that the land, even when floating on water, is sacred. Every year, these traditions are celebrated in the Festival of the Chinampa, a gathering that draws families from across Mexico City to the waterways of Xochimilco. Canoes are decorated with vibrant flowers, their bright petals spilling over the edges like bursts of color. Farmers bring their best produce, stacking baskets high with fresh maize, squash, and beans. There is music and dancing, the sounds of flutes and drums mingling with the soft lap of water against the banks. It's a celebration of life and legacy, a reminder that the Chinampas are not just relics, they are alive, thriving, and deeply connected to the people who work them. Historians still debate the origins of the Festival of the Chinampa. Some claim it is a modern invention, created to preserve interest in Xochimilco as tourism grew. Others insist it is a direct descendant of Aztec harvest festivals, a living link to Tenochtitlan's grand celebrations of abundance. Whatever its beginnings, the festival is a testament to the endurance of tradition, a celebration of farming and community that transcends time. As you paddle through the canals, you notice trajineras, the colorful, flat-bottomed boats that drift lazily along the water, their passengers laughing and singing. These boats have become symbols of Xochimilco, carrying families and tourists alike through the canals, their bright canopies of flowers nodding gently with each ripple. The boats pass by the Chinampas, their occupants waving to the farmers, who pause to smile and nod in return. It's a small gesture, but it speaks to the deep-rooted respect for the land and those who tend it. In many ways, the trajineras are floating celebrations of the Chinampas themselves. Visitors come to Xochimilco not just to see the water gardens, but to experience them, to taste fresh elote corn roasted on tiny braziers, to sip pulque in clay cups, and to listen to mariachi bands that drift alongside, their music echoing off the water. For many, it's more than a tourist attraction. It's a pilgrimage, a chance to connect with a living piece of Mexico's history. Historians still argue whether this modern fascination with Xochimilco is enough to save the Chinampas. Some claim that tourism, though lucrative, is only a temporary solution, masking the deeper problems of pollution and urban sprawl. Others believe that the growing awareness of the Chinampas' cultural significance will drive real change, encouraging investment in preservation and sustainable farming. But as you watch the trajineras drift by, their passengers laughing and reaching out to touch the water, it's clear that the spirit of the Chinampas endures. You paddle further down the canal, passing small family plots where children help their parents tend to the crops. They laugh and splash in the water, their hands dark with soil as they pull weeds and plant seeds. Their parents watch with quiet pride, their hands guiding small fingers through the motions of planting and caring for the earth. It's more than just farming, it's teaching, a way of passing down knowledge that has survived conquests, revolutions, and modernization. At the far edge of the Chinampas, you find community projects aimed at keeping these traditions alive. Local organizations have partnered with farmers to teach sustainable practices, offering workshops in crop rotation, natural pest control, and water management. Students visit from nearby universities, their notebooks filled with sketches and notes as they listen to farmers explain the ancient methods. It's a quiet revival, one plant at a time, one row at a time. Historians still debate the future of the Chinampas. Some fear that urban expansion and pollution will finally overwhelm the canals, turning the water gardens into distant memories. Others are more hopeful, pointing to the revival efforts in Xochimilco and the global interest in sustainable farming. What is clear is that the Chinampas are more than just floating farms. They are symbols of resilience, community, and the enduring spirit of the Aztecs. As the sun dips low over the water, casting long shadows across the rows of maize and squash, you watch as the farmers pack up their tools, their hands still dark with soil. They climb into their canoes, paddling slowly down the canals, the water whispering softly against the sides of their boats. The Chinampas sway gently in their wake, anchored deep in the mud of Lake Texcoco, holding fast against the passage of time. Next, we'll explore how the international spotlight has found the Chinampas once again, highlighting their importance not just to Mexico, but to the world as a model of sustainable agriculture and community resilience. The morning light reflects off the waters of Xochimilco, casting shimmering ripples that dance along the edges of the Chinampas. The fields are lush and green, stretching out across the canals like floating carpets of life. But today, the story of the Chinampas isn't just confined to Mexico's borders. It has stepped onto the international stage, drawing the attention of environmentalists, urban planners, and sustainable farming advocates around the world. In the past decade, the Chinampas have become a symbol of resilience and sustainability, a model of how ancient wisdom can solve modern problems. As global populations swell and cities expand, the question of how to feed millions sustainably has grown more urgent. The floating gardens of Tenochtitlan, once thought to be relics of the past, are now seen as a blueprint for the future. Historians still debate how much of the original Chinampa method can be applied to modern urban centers. Some argue that the unique ecosystem of Lake Texcoco allowed the floating farms to thrive in ways that can't be replicated elsewhere. Others believe the principles of self-watering soil beds and nutrient cycling are universally adaptable, capable of transforming urban landscapes into sustainable food sources. You paddle slowly through the canals, watching as farmers tend to their rows of maize and beans, their hands brushing gently over the leaves. It's almost surreal to think that this ancient practice is now being studied in places like New York City, Singapore, and Tokyo, where urban planners are experimenting with rooftop gardens and vertical farming techniques inspired by the Chinampas. The concept of floating farms is being adapted to fit modern infrastructure, with hydroponic towers and water-based greenhouses sprouting up in urban centers. In the Netherlands, a country famous for its struggle against rising water levels, engineers have begun experimenting with floating agricultural platforms, inspired by the design of the Chinampas. These modern adaptations use buoyant frames that rise and fall with the tide, allowing crops to flourish even as water levels change. It's a modern take on Aztec ingenuity, blending ancient methods with contemporary technology to solve the age-old problem of farming on water. Historians still argue whether these floating farms are true to the spirit of the Chinampas. Some claim that the reliance on modern materials like plastics and metal frameworks is a departure from the organic simplicity of the Aztec design. Others insist that adaptation is part of the legacy, that the Aztecs themselves were innovators who constantly refined their methods to meet the demands of their growing empire. Regardless of the debate, the influence of the Chinampas is unmistakable. You continue down the canal, the water smooth and clear beneath your canoe. At the far end, a group of international students is gathered, their notebooks open, their hands sketching diagrams of the floating gardens. They listen intently, as a local farmer explains the method of layering soil and mud, of planting beans alongside corn to replenish nitrogen in the soil. Their eyes are wide with curiosity, their pens scratching quickly across the pages. These are the students who will bring these ideas back to their own cities, who will spread the legacy of the Chinampas far beyond the waters of Xochimilco. And it isn't just farming. The philosophy of balance and sustainability that underpins the Chinampas has sparked movements in urban design and ecological restoration. Cities around the world are rethinking how green spaces are integrated into urban planning, looking back at Tenochtitlan for inspiration. Concepts like green roofs, rain gardens, and permaculture are rooted in the same principles that sustained the floating farms for centuries. The idea is simple, yet profound. Work with nature, not against it. Historians still debate whether these modern movements fully capture the spirit of the Chinampas. Some claim that the use of technology and artificial materials dilutes the purity of the original design. Others argue that the true spirit of the Chinampas lies in their adaptability and resilience, that innovation is exactly what the Aztecs would have embraced. What's undeniable is the global interest in these ancient practices. Proof that some solutions are timeless. You paddle further along, passing community gardens that stretch out along the banks. Local families are planting rows of vegetables, their hands moving with careful precision. Signs mark these plots as part of an urban gardening initiative, an effort to revive the spirit of the Chinampas in the heart of Mexico City. Children laugh and chase each other between the rows, their fingers sticky with dirt, their voices rising above the soft lap of water against the banks. It's a celebration of life, of tradition, and of the enduring power of the floating gardens. Beyond Mexico, there are whispers of international collaborations aimed at reviving Chinampa-style farming in regions struggling with food insecurity and climate change. In Southeast Asia, where flooding is a constant threat, engineers are studying the buoyancy and water management of the Chinampas as a way to create sustainable food sources during the monsoon season. In the Middle East, where water is scarce, the idea of self-irrigating gardens is being explored as a way to combat desertification and boost local food production. Historians still debate whether these adaptations will be successful in the long term. Some claim that the ecological conditions of Lake Texcoco were uniquely suited for the Chinampas, and that attempts to replicate the method in other environments will fall short. Others are more optimistic, pointing to the ingenuity of modern engineers and the growing global movement toward sustainable agriculture. What is clear is that the legacy of Tenochtitlan lives on, its influence stretching far beyond the waters of Xochimilco as the sun sets, casting golden light over the rippling surface of the canals. You watch as the farmers paddle back to shore, their boats heavy with fresh produce. The students pack up their notebooks, their voices still animated with excitement as they discuss what they've learned. The water is calm, the gardens are lush, and the spirit of the Chinampas is alive, not just in Mexico, but in the minds and hearts of those who dream of a greener, more sustainable future. Next, we'll delve into the spiritual and symbolic significance of the Chinampas, exploring how they were seen not just as gardens, but as sacred spaces that bridged the earth and the water, connecting life to the divine. The morning sun casts its first light over the glimmering canals of Xochimilco, illuminating the rows of lush green Chinampas that float like islands on the water's surface. The mist hangs low, swirling gently as canoes drift through the narrow waterways, their paddles cutting silent ripples across the stillness. But today, you're not just seeing the Chinampas as floating gardens, you're stepping into their spiritual and symbolic significance, the deeper meaning that rooted them in the hearts of the Aztec people. To the Aztecs, the Chinampas were more than just fields of maize and squash. They were sacred spaces, reflections of the harmony between earth and water. In their mythology, the earth itself was born from water, raised from the depths by the gods to create land where life could thrive. The chinampas mirrored this divine act of creation, floating plots of soil drawn from the lake, sustained by the life-giving waters of Lake Texcoco. Each planting was an echo of that first act of creation, a ritual that tied the farmers to the gods and to the very essence of life. Historians still debate the extent to which spirituality influenced the design and maintenance of the chinampas. Some claim that the careful layering of mud, reeds, and soil was purely practical, a method perfected through trial and error. Others suggest it was deeply symbolic, a reflection of the Aztec belief in the three realms, the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and the waters below. The chinampas, floating on water but tethered to the earth, were seen as sacred spaces where all three realms touched. You paddle slowly through the canals, feeling the stillness of the water beneath you. Farmers are already at work, their hands moving gently over the plants, whispering quiet words as they tend to their crops. It's a ritual of care, almost reverent, a tradition that stretches back for centuries. You watch as a woman sprinkles water over the soil, her hands moving with practiced grace. She murmurs softly, her voice almost a whisper, a blessing for the harvest, a prayer for the rains. In Aztec culture, Tlaloc, the god of rain, was a central figure in agriculture. His blessings were essential for the success of the crops, and rituals were performed regularly to honor him. Offerings of maize, beans, and even small clay figurines were placed at the edges of the chinampas, buried in the soil to ensure a bountiful harvest. During times of drought, entire communities would gather along the banks of the canals, their voices rising in song and prayer, calling upon Tlaloc to open the skies and bless the fields with rain. Historians still argue whether these rituals were purely symbolic or if they held deeper social functions. Some claim that the ceremonies were a form of community bonding, a way to bring farmers together in shared purpose and hope. Others believe they were expressions of deep faith, acts of devotion to the gods that the Aztecs believed truly influenced the rains and the harvests. But as you watch the farmers move through the rows of maize and squash, their hands brushing reverently over the leaves, it's hard not to feel that connection. The chinampas weren't just sacred because of the earth and water. They also symbolized the cycle of life and death. In Aztec belief, life was cyclical, and the chinampas reflected that eternal rhythm. Each planting represented new life, each harvest a moment of abundance, and each layer of mud and soil a testament to renewal. Farmers would often sprinkle ashes from burnt crops back into the soil, believing that the remnants of the old harvest would bring life to the new. You watch as a farmer scatters dark ash over the rows of beans, his hands careful and deliberate. He moves with the confidence of tradition, his eyes scanning the fields with a kind of quiet pride. It's a cycle that has been repeated for generations, a ritual of life and death, of planting and harvest, woven into the very fabric of the chinampas. But it wasn't just the farmers who saw the chinampas as sacred. During major festivals, the floating gardens became sites of ritual and celebration. Families would gather along the banks, lighting candles and leaving offerings of flowers and food at the water's edge. The canals would fill with trajineras decorated with bright blossoms, their decks stacked with fresh produce and woven baskets of maize and beans. The air would fill with the scent of incense and the sound of drums, a celebration of life and the bounty of the earth. Historians still debate the purpose of these celebrations. Some argue that they were purely agricultural, meant to honor the changing seasons and ensure good harvests. Others suggest that they were deeply spiritual, acts of devotion that tied the people of Tenochtitlan to the land and the gods who watched over it. Regardless of their origins, the festivals were joyous events, moments of unity, celebration, and gratitude for the bounty that the floating gardens provided. As you paddle further along the canal, you notice small shrines nestled along the edges of the chinampas. Simple, but carefully maintained. These shrines are adorned with flowers and tiny clay figurines, their surfaces dusted with pollen and ash. Farmers pause as they pass, bowing their heads in respect, sometimes pausing to light a small candle or sprinkle water from the canal as an offering. It's a gesture of gratitude, a moment of connection between the farmer, the land, and the gods. Historians still marvel at the resilience of these traditions. Despite conquest, colonization, and modernization, the rituals of the Chinampas endure. Farmers still plant with care, still offer prayers for rain, still gather at the water's edge to celebrate the harvest. It's a legacy that speaks not just of survival, but of reverence, a connection to the past that is honored in the present and preserved for the future. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows over the green rows of the Chinampas, you watch as farmers pack up their tools, pausing to touch the soil with their fingertips before climbing into their canoes. The water laps gently at the banks, whispering against the reeds and willows. It's more than just a farm. It's a sacred space, a living connection to the spirit of Tenochtitlan and the gods who watched over it. Next, we'll drift through the canals one last time to witness the wind down of the day, exploring the quiet moments that close the rhythm of life on the Chinampas before we bid farewell to the floating gardens. The sun dips low over the water, casting long shadows across the surface of the canals. The Chinampas, with their rows of green maize and vibrant squash, sway gently in the evening breeze. The air is thick with the scent of fresh soil and water, the sounds of distant laughter, and the gentle splash of paddles cutting through the stillness. Today, you're drifting through the wind down of the day, a ritual as old as the floating gardens themselves, a moment of quiet reflection and gentle closure. You paddle slowly through the canals, the water smooth and glassy beneath your canoe. The farmers are finishing their day's work, their hands brushing off soil, their tools stacked neatly along the banks. The last of the harvest is being loaded into canoes, baskets filled with fresh tomatoes, beans, and bundles of herbs, each one stacked with care and tied off with woven strands of reed. The light is soft now, golden and warm, spilling across the rows of plants and illuminating the narrow paths that wind between the gardens. Historians still debate whether the daily routine of the Chinampas changed significantly over the centuries. Some claim that little has altered, that the same methods perfected in Tenochtitlan are still used by the farmers of Xochimilco today. Others argue that subtle shifts, new tools, different seeds, and modern adaptations have woven their way into the ancient rhythm. But as you watch the farmers move between the rows, their hands careful and deliberate, it's clear that the heart of the practice remains unchanged. You watch as a woman stands at the edge of a chinampa, her hands cupped around the soft green leaves of a squash plant. She murmurs quietly, her voice low and musical, almost like a song. It's a blessing, a ritual of thanks whispered softly over the soil. Her hands move gently, brushing away stray bits of dust, smoothing the earth around the roots. For her, this is more than just a job. It's a way of life, a tradition that stretches back through generations. Tethered to the legacy of Tenochtitlan, the waterways grow quiet as the last of the canoes paddle back toward the docks. Their hulls are low in the water, heavy with the day's harvest. The farmers steer with practiced ease, their hands steady on the paddles, their eyes scanning the water for stray reeds or floating debris. They nod to one another as they pass, their voices soft and familiar. It's a rhythm of departure, a gentle closing of the day that feels almost sacred. Historians still argue over whether these daily routines are remnants of Aztec spirituality or simply habits born from necessity. Some claim that the quiet wind down, the gentle handling of the crops, the whispered blessings are all echoes of Aztec rituals, moments of connection with the gods who watched over the harvest. Others suggest that it's purely practical, a careful way to tend the plants and prepare for the next day's work. But as you watch the farmers move with such tenderness and care, it's hard not to sense something deeper, a reverence for the land, a respect for the life it provides. The light fades softly, casting long shadows across the chinampas. You can see the flicker of small fires at the water's edge, where families gather to share a simple meal. Women prepare fresh tortillas over hot coals. the scent of roasted maize drifting across the water. Children chase each other along the banks, their laughter ringing out like soft bells, their bare feet pattering over the soft soil. It's a scene of calm, of peace, a quiet moment of togetherness after a long day's work. You paddle further along the canal, your canoe gliding smoothly over the water's surface. The air is cool now, the first hints of night brushing against your skin. The water laps gently at the edges of the chinampas, whispering against the reeds and willows. You pause for a moment, watching as the farmers light small lanterns, their glow casting soft pools of light across the surface of the water. It's a ritual that speaks of both practicality and tradition, a way to guide the last canoes back to the docks, and a gentle reminder that even in the quiet moments, the floating gardens are alive. Historians still debate whether these evening rituals were purely practical or if they held deeper symbolic meaning. Some claim that the lanterns were simply a way to find the path home, while others suggest they were part of a spiritual practice, a light to honor the gods of water and earth. But as the lights flicker softly across the canals, it's easy to believe that there is something sacred in the ritual, a memory of Tenochtitlan glowing softly against the darkness. As the last of the farmers drift away, their canoes slipping into the shadows, the chinampas grow still. The water is smooth and dark, reflecting the first stars that flicker above. The fields are quiet now, their rows of plants swaying gently in the breeze, their roots anchored deep in the mud of Lake Texcoco. It's a moment of peace, a breath held in the cool air of evening. You close your eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of fresh soil and water, feeling the gentle sway of the canoe beneath you. The chinampas are still here, alive, thriving, carrying with them the spirit of Tenochtitlan and the wisdom of the past. They whisper of resilience, of community, of a people who learned to make the earth float upon the water, and who fed an empire from the mud and reeds of a sacred lake. And as the stars stretch out across the sky, reflecting in the stillness of the canals, you realize that the story of the chinampas is not just history, it's a promise that with care, with respect, and with a little ingenuity, we can live in harmony with the earth. Just as the Aztecs did all those centuries ago, the water is still now, the moon casting silver light across the surface of the canals. The chinampas are quiet, their rows of maize and squash resting peacefully beneath the stars. You drift slowly, your canoe gliding silently through the water, the only sound the soft lapping against the wooden sides. The day is done, the work complete, and the floating gardens breathe in the calm of the night. You feel the coolness of the air settle around you, the gentle sway of the water beneath you, as if the lake itself is breathing, rising and falling with the rhythm of the earth. The farmers are gone, their lanterns snuffed out, their canoes tied safely at the docks, but their spirit lingers, whispering through the leaves, brushing gently over the water's edge. The chinampas are more than just gardens. They are living memories, floating on the surface of a lake that cradles the echoes of Tenochtitlan. They are whispers of resilience, of harmony, of a time when water and earth worked in perfect synchrony to feed a thriving city. And as you drift through the quiet canals, you feel that spirit settle around you, calm, eternal, unyielding. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the gentle sway of the water carry you away. The chinampas are still here, floating beneath the stars, holding fast to the memory of a city that lived on water and thrived against all odds. Rest easy now, and let the whispers of the water cradle you to sleep.